All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. For those of you that came in person, we've got some food and drinks and whatnot. You probably found that already. I think we have well over 100 people online as well. So very happy to have nearly 200 people sign up for the program. So that's fantastic. So we will do our best to educate and entertain you today. Probably more education than entertainment. But yeah, so everyone, welcome to the Capital Factory in Austin here. There's apparently a cricket migration going on in Austin right now, which I was very excited to hear about because I happened to see one of these little critters and was like, what kind of hotel did we book here? But it turned out to be a friendly little critter that was just hatched, and they're moving across Texas apparently. I've only seen one, so don't be nervous. They're friendly, they don't bite. I'm going to hand it over to Nate here pretty quick, but we have a great program. We're going to cover, FDA topics. Nate's going to chat a bit about readiness and some things you should be thinking about if you're getting ready to submit to the FDA. Amanda, Paul, and David are also covering various topics, including compliance and privacy, cybersecurity, litigation topics as well. And then I'll be hosting a panel at the end. So excited to take your questions for that and introduce you to our esteemed panel. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Nate. If you have questions, just ask those on the chat. We will be monitoring that, and we're happy to take those questions.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here this morning. Mark's gone over the agenda. So my name is Nate Downing, and today what I want to give to you is some thoughts on assessing your medtech's maturity, whether you're doing due diligence, making acquisitions, or you're a startup. What are some things that I've seen from my experience that could be better considered earlier on in the process that'll give you a more likelihood of success? So any questions during, especially in room, raise your hand. And then as Mark said, we are monitoring the chat as well. So there's my picture. You can see me on video. So gauging maturity, what I really want to do is give you my experience, right? Talk about medical product classification. What issues arise from that? What are some ways to burn down that risk? And what are things that I see that people struggle, companies struggle with in that area? And then some quality system considerations. I think sometimes quality systems can be an afterthought, right? There's a lot of good excitement, there's technology, there's helping patients, there's clinical studies, and we get ready to go to FDA and we forget to document the things we've done. Submission readiness, right? We've done all this work to get ready. And then the submission itself, the very thing we're going to interface through with FDA that's going to give us our product clearance or approval, we have a week or 2 weeks to put it together, and now we're giving ourselves deficiencies and limiting the amount of time we have to adequately address and to stave off issues that could come up in a submission. FDA interactions, I often will touch on some type of FDA interaction when I present, because I think it's so important that when you are interacting with FDA, you've got a plan, you've got a story, and you take advantage of it to give you the best chance of success. And then a post-market action plan. If you are 5 years from getting approval, you still want to know what's going to happen once you get that approval, right? A lot of your valuation is going to go into that assessment. What claims are you going to make? What are you going to be able to do to continue to promote your product? And a lot of that is going to come through what kind of action plan do you have once you've gotten clearance, once you've gotten approval, whatever it might be. So medical product classification. I think that when companies come to me and they say, hey, I've got a widget that does X, I say, great. What else does it do? What is it going to be doing ultimately when you're marketing it? And so that first comes out in the classification. So if you're in the drug space, now I will say today a lot of my framing is going to be through the medical device lens, but it's going to be very applicable to all areas of FDA interaction. But if you're in a drug, do you have just a traditional, you've got a new IND, you've got a traditional NDA path? Great, you know how long that'll take. Are there available therapies you could take advantage of, right? Some accelerated opportunities. Do you have fast track? Do you have breakthrough? Do you have data that gets you to a breakthrough designation? And so understanding your classification is going to help you get there. And then even thinking about, priority review as part of that drug path. And then you get down to a device, right? Classification for a device is really important and is really going to set your strategy. Are you a PMA? Well, if you require a class 3 and a PMA, that is way different than if you require a 510K. So if you're a PMA, understanding that early on, understanding your class 3 designation is going to help you. Are you a de novo, right? I think sometimes people are afraid to say de novo. It's not the end of the world to me, right? There's clinical evidence often required that may not have been, but you're going to create a new classification. And so much technology that's coming out today is unique. It is different, right? Using AI and machine learning. So you are going to have some difficulty in finding a predicate. And if you can identify that you're de novo early on and be confident in your assessment, you're going to have a much better strat plan going forward to getting that de novo market authorization earlier than if you backed into de novo because you couldn't find a predicate at the last minute, right? So planning ahead and understanding those pathways. Then are you a 510K, traditional 510K? Is there a good predicate? I think everyone knows the pathway there, but being solid in that assessment early on is going to save you a lot of time and money. Are you exempt? Are you a class 1 device? And we'll talk about a little bit later some of the issues with saying, yes, I am exempt, but not really being exempt, right? And that's going to come through as on your intended use. And then you could think about other things like humanitarian use, and then understanding breakthrough device designation. Are you going to be able to apply for that based on your classification, right? If you say your device is a lot better, but it's an exempt device, and your device is going to treat something life-threatening, but it's exempt, right? You can already see that's not going to add up. So understanding even the kind of strategy you want to put forth in FDA is going to feed into your classification. And then a few other things, right, to think about: medical foods, cosmetics, dietary supplements. Are you trying to take the path of a medical food, a supplement, or a cosmetic, but make drug or device claims? Because eventually what's going to happen is you're going to run afoul of FDA, and all that time you thought you saved is going to be in the back burner now, and you're going to have to start over. So really understanding the classification. So where does that classification come from? Your intended use, right? What is the intended use of your product? Well, it's whatever your device or drug does. Well, not fully, right? It's more than that. As FDA says, it's really anything relevant. So the first thing I like to tell companies is, do you have someone from marketing involved that can take the things that you say your device or drug does and then extrapolate it? What is its marketability? What are you going to say that it does? What are you wanting to sell for a patient population? What kind of claims do you need to make? Because if that doesn't square with the intended use you chose, you're really not going to be setting yourself up for future success. You're going to have something that's approved that the marketing says, I can't sell this, right? Doctors aren't resonating with this to use on their patients. So your marketing plan really has to feed into your final intended use. Then your capabilities. There's a strategy involved here and so I put capability second because there's a strategy. You may not want to get clearance approval or even seek an NDA for your full capability, right? You've got to think about the capital it takes to do these things. So you might take a phased approach. But whatever your capabilities are, they're not going to be fully realized if your intended use doesn't match those. So make sure that when you're adjudicating, you're finalizing your intended use that's going to feed into your classification, the capabilities you want to utilize are accounted for in that. And then, is there a predicate in market? I put predicate in quotes because I'm not thinking it's so much in the 510K sense, but in the sense of, is there a similar PMA device? Can you look at their clinical strategy? What did their clinical study look like? What did a drug look like, right? Can you take advantage of an available therapy shortcut to get your product on the market faster? Was there a de novo that was similar? While you can't use them as a predicate, you saw the path that they used from a de novo process, and you're able to look at their clinical strategy, their ver and val strategy. All those types of predicates, even though you can't use them in the submission to point to and say, hey, we're a 510K, they're going to set you up for success because they're going to give you more predictability. So understanding those things as they tie into in your intended use is going to greatly enhance your ability to have predictability as you even hatch your strategy, hatch your FDA plan. And then thinking through your classification, product codes and regulations, this really fits with the device, right? If you are trying to have a device that's going to do a lot, but then you find a product code that's easy or regulation that's exempt, they're not going to marry very well, right? So you need to think, does this product code, does this regulation match my full capability, match my full marketing plan, and match anything in the market that I want to be able to compare against? If not, then maybe that shortcut's not going to get you what you think it does. So when you're thinking about medical product classification, I want you to think intended use, think long-term, but also think in steps if necessary, right? I'm going to get my product on market as a cleared device, and then I'm going to do more studies. I'm going to use whatever I can gain from my current marketing to have capital and continue to further my evidence plan. So there's a lot of opportunity here, but also if you don't have a plan around your classification, things can blow up really quickly. So what are some issues that can come up when you're trying to classify a product? Well, confidence in your assessment, right? You might be someone who's a brilliant physician and you've got a really cool idea. And so you've looked up a couple of things for predicate devices and you say, well, this is a 510K device, but I'm not confident because I don't really know, right? But for the last 2 years, I've been telling and acting like I have a predicate. Well, if you're not confident in that assessment, you can't really have confidence in your future plans. You can't have confidence in your forecasting, the spend that you need to do all that. So you're going to want to find ways to be confident, right? You're going to want to find experts. You're going to want to make sure you're having conversations with clinical, with marketing, with regulatory, with engineering, with business leaders. All of those individuals are going to put thoughts into place that are going to help you gain more confidence. And then what if it is misclassified? Let's say that you've made an assessment you weren't quite confident in, and now it's been misclassified. Well, if it's pre-market, your issues are going to be a waste of time, waste of dollars, right? So if you are acting like it's a 510K, but it ends up being a PMA, and you have to go through a full new pivotal trial, that could be 2 to 3 years. You can imagine the capital it takes to do 2 to 3 years more of something than you originally planned on doing before you're starting to get a return on that investment. So that's a major risk. What if you overclassify? Well, if you thought it was a PMA or if you thought it was a 510K and FDA says it's exempt, you spent more money than you had to. It's probably a little bit better because you are going to get to market sooner. But still, you did have to do some steps you didn't need to. And then what about post-market? Let's say you've gone through and you've gotten your 510K cleared and now you're ready to go. But I want to make claims beyond this. And I took a conservative approach for clearance. And so now you have to worry about misbranding your device, right? You can't be making claims that aren't consistent with your labeling. So it can happen pre-market, post-market that these misclassification issues are going to prop up. What are some ways to burn down risk? As I kind of suggested earlier, making sure you're talking to the right experts, but also getting in front of FDA if you need to, right? There are various pathways with FDA. Especially if you start thinking this early enough, you're not going to lose time by going to FDA and confirming your pathway. So making sure you understand the experts that can help you burn down that risk, as well as getting to FDA and having a plan to get to FDA early. So some quality system considerations, right? You can't go to FDA if you don't have documentation, right? We all know FDA works on data, they work on documents, they work on proving what you said you were going to do and then doing it. And so do you have your design history file? Do you have your technical documentation if this is the EU? Do you have whatever analogous thing it might be to the DHF? Do you have that ready? And have you started creating that early on in the process, that you're not doing a post hoc kind of piecing together something and there's going to be holes that FDA is going to have to focus on, that a regulatory body is going to have to focus on? Your risk management. I often see companies doing risk management last, right? Because they've built up a really good product, they've got their design inputs, they've been testing, they've been doing their VAR and VAL, which does feed into some of the risk documents, but they haven't been building a risk management file to be able to prove they've mitigated risks as low as they can, right? So when you're doing that backwards and you're putting that last, you're opening holes and you're opening opportunity for FDA to not be confident in your risk assessment. And then global readiness. So your quality system, right, you may not just be thinking US, you might be thinking US and EU and Canada and Korea and Japan and on and on and on. And so start to build your quality system with all of that in mind, right? The 820 harmonization with, 1345, that's something, that's a step. It's not gonna make a big difference. That's a couple years from now, and that's really, incorporating the ISO 1345 by reference, but still, that's something that FDA is starting to get more and say, hey, let's be more global ready, right? 820 needs to be a little bit more flexible, so you're not creating a new quality system every time. So if you build your system, take that into account and have a plan for which geographies you want to go. And then good documentation practices. This goes to everything, but essentially a quality system. Your quality system documents need to be auditable, they need to be ready, they need to be approved. Think about major versions, think about the story they tell from parent to child documentation. All of those things are going to help you get through FDA, because if FDA can pull up your quality system and see a story, they're going to be able to tell themselves the story that they need to hear to be confident in your documentation and your testing. So those good documentation practices, which are always important as lawyers, right? But in that quality system, any mistake can bog down your review. And so having those early on and making sure you give yourself enough time is going to feed into quality documents. So you've got your classification, you've got your quality system ready, you've got your deliverables ready, and now you want to go to FDA. So what are some considerations to make sure that you're ready? Well, first off, I've already alluded to this before, but do you have a complete design history file? Or are you still trying to do things while you've submitted to FDA, right? There's a big difference there. And some companies sometimes will have to take the risk and say, well, this isn't quite a deliverable yet, so I'm going to finish this testing while it's under review by FDA, and if they ask, we'll deliver it. Fine. You know, if you can avoid that by earlier planning, you're going to put yourself in better shape to not have a deficiency that could bog down an approval or a clearance. And so making sure you've got complete documentation. What is your evidence to support your verification, validation testing? Are they complete? Do you have clear plans and clear reports which state and prove what you said you were going to do that you did? Or do you have issues in your verification and validation, your plans or reports or your samples? Or maybe you had a final device, for example, using the device lens as a example, that changed. And so now you've got to justify, but you're trying to use older testing and you haven't accounted for that. You haven't put some type of rationale together, right? So those are all issues where FDA is going to say, hold up, we can't even get to your approval or clearance because we need to figure out what's going on with your testing. That's going to bog you down and take time and money. Clinical evidence, right? For so many products, clinical evidence is necessary. It also feeds into your claims, the way you're going to be able to sell your device, you sell your drugs, sell whatever. And so making sure that you've got a good clinical evidence plan, you've got a clear stats plan and a stats report, right? FDA lives in the world of data. So if you don't have clear, provable endpoints, FDA may not accept your data. They may say, hey, great, from an observational standpoint, it looks like your device might do some great things. Now let's prove it. Let's test some hypotheses and make sure that we're getting to, ultimately benefit patients. FDA standards. Does FDA have standards on whatever it is that your medical product? Are you accounting for those? Are you pointing out that, yes, we've met these standards? FDA guidance documents, such as the cybersecurity. Are you addressing the guidance documents, right? They're not law, but they're FDA's best thinking. So if you want to get through FDA smoothly, I would recommend addressing those guidance documents, using the report template, using whatever it is that FDA is asking for in each document, and being clear, and even saying in your submission, based on X guidance document, FDA, here's what we did, and here's the output of that. And then known issues. Are there things you should be addressing in your submission so that when FDA sees them, instead of FDA thinking, oh, there's an issue here, FDA says there's an issue here, but company X has addressed it, and they've let us understand why this issue should not foreclose any clearance or approval, right? So I think understanding that you might have an issue, but being clear with FDA and giving a rationale, right? You can't just point out an issue and put your hands up. You're going to point out an issue and say, hey, FDA, you're going to see this, but this is what we've done to mitigate this. Or you're going to look now at this test report to understand that some of this was redone, whatever it might be, to show, hey, FDA, there's an issue, but we've addressed it. How do you limit deficiencies? We all know that the submission is not the end. There's going to be likely a round of deficiencies, especially the more complex you are, NDA, a PMA. It's just more likely FDA is going to have questions. So how do you limit them? Remember your audience. Remember that you're writing for regulators. And so if you know something and it's clear to you, great. But make sure you explicitly state it to FDA as well, right? You cannot be too simple. Simple language. Point to what they need to know. Point to what a notified body needs to know. Whoever your audience is, know them and talk to people who have submitted before, right? Take time to make sure experiences are incorporated into your submission. Have clear communication, simple paragraphs, headings. Let every regulatory agency know exactly what you're going to give them in each section, and then deliver exactly what you said you would deliver. Address issues. I've got that again here because that is the main thing to limit deficiencies. If you know there's an issue, but you can address it beforehand and give a satisfactory answer, the regulatory body doesn't have to ask you about it, right? So you're saving time and money. And then deliver what you promise. Always deliver what you promise to any regulatory agency. So FDA interactions, I've got FDA here, it really goes to anyone, but this is more specific to FDA too. So pre-submissions, take advantage of pre-submissions. Do you have a new or unique medical product that FDA hasn't seen before? Do an informational pre-sub. Start to educate FDA before you even ask a question, because why would you want to ask a question if FDA is not going to really know anything about your product? And then they might give you an answer that isn't what you're looking for. Now you have to have multiple rounds of pre-submissions, right? So use the opportunity for an informational pre-sub. Ask pre-submissions if you have a clear question, right? So if you have a clear issue that you know of and you can offer a solution as well, it's even better. Go to FDA with it, go early so you can incorporate whatever their feedback is. There's other pre-submissions, it's broad, right? There's other types of pre-work that can be done for classification, as alluded to earlier. As you submit, what kind of FDA interactions can you have? Well, you could reach out and say, hey, do you have any questions? Let me know. Find out who your reviewer is. Establish a relationship as soon as you can, because it'll help you during review now, establishing that relationship. If there's a simple question, FDA notified body, they might feel comfortable saying, hey, I couldn't find this document. Is it there? And you can say, oh, yeah, it's in Appendix E or whatever. And now instead of getting a deficiency, you've optimized your interactions with the regulatory agency and you're stopping deficiencies and you're speeding up the process to that ultimate decision. And then after the decision, approval clearance. My main interaction there is read that letter closely, make sure there's no limitations, make sure your indication is exactly as you want it. Are there some labeling submissions that you still have outstanding? Understand what tasks you may have left. Did it not go the way you wanted? Make sure that you can reach out to the reviewer, right? Try to keep a dialogue open. There's no mechanism that says they have to, but it doesn't hurt to offer. It doesn't hurt to ask and reach out, right? More interaction is better than less, as long as it's meaningful and you're respectful. So in the last couple of minutes, let's further with this FDA communication strategy. Take advantage of every opportunity. A missed chance to communicate with FDA is just a greater likelihood that they're not going to understand something. Have a story. I put story in quotes because it's not some story to trick anyone, right? It's my device does this, my drug does this, over and over again. When I speak to FDA, I'm going to use that same terminology. I'm going to know which experts can speak to which issue before I go in front of FDA to ensure that we're having consistency with our communication. And then I'm going to offer a partner with FDA. Hey, FDA, would you like to get on a call? This is a little bit confusing. This is really advanced software. I could hop on a call with you and walk you through the architecture and maybe save you 5 hours of your own time, right? So partnering with FDA will allow them to partner with you. And then have a post-market action plan, right? It's very important. Even 3 years, 2 years before you get on market, what are you going to do once you get that letter? What's your promotional strategy? Are you going to be able to make the claims you want, or do you still have to generate evidence and making sure that you're not having any misleading claims because you don't have substantiation yet, right? Having an early plan will allow you to be to predict what your ultimate marketing strategy will be, and it'll avoid trouble, right? Have a good MLR team in place to make sure that you have medical, legal, and regulatory reviewing the claims you want to make. Change control. Have a change control plan. Do you have an AI device, an artificial intelligence device that is updating constantly? Well, did you talk to FDA about what it looks like from a change control standpoint? So you're not submitting a 90-day RTR every 3 weeks because there's something new in your device, and FDA, under the kind of current archaic, if you will, from an AI perspective, guidance says you should have submitted. Evidence generation. Are there some post-market studies you can run? Do you need to do an IDE or an IND? Understanding that early on will allow you to plan for it, right? Set aside capital, get the resources and timing necessary to keep furthering your claims. And then be proactive, not reactive, right? And anything with FDA, get ahead of it. If you're going to have an issue, if you need to talk about a recall, get ahead of it. Make sure your team internally is assessing any issues, and if there are issues, getting out in front of them. So, in that 25-ish minutes, what would I want you to take away? Well, a successful business plan has to involve an FDA strategy that goes beyond, I have really good technology, right? Because you have to show FDA that you do have good technology and that you can make a difference to patients, and you can do this safely and effectively, right? So making sure that you involve the FDA and those experts with the FDA and early on is going to give you more success. it can save or cost many months, right? I was talking through a few examples of how you can lose months, if not years, if you misclassify something. Or it can save you, right? If you find a predicate early on and you've got a good strategy and you've gone to FDA, you might save a year because there was some testing avoided. A successful plan also creates consistency with FDA. If FDA sees things that are inconsistent, sees different things in slides and presentations, they're not going to trust you, right? They're going to think, well, you can't deliver even in a message. How are you going to deliver in your design? How are you going to deliver in your manufacturing, in your clinical documentation, right? So consistency early on is going to set you up for success. And then remember, market authorization is just the beginning. Getting your product to market is a major milestone and will help patients, but you need to continue utilizing all of these tools to further evidence, to make sure you've got a quality system in place that's adapting to whatever updates to your device or drug may be coming. Utilizing the FDA strategy will give your company, your startup, or if you're doing due diligence to a startup, give you more confidence that you've got a plan to get to FDA and get your product on market. I appreciate your time this morning. I'm happy to take any questions for the next couple of minutes if there are any. But like I said, don't fear FDA, but make sure you're planful and you understand and respect them because they're your ultimate audience. And right, FDA, EU, notified body, whomever it might be, but be ready and make sure you take advantage of time while you still have it. Thank you.
Any questions in the audience? There aren't any online. Oh, hold on. Gotta get you the mic.
Nate, I was just curious, like, do you ever have a situation where you're approaching FDA and the sponsor really needs to know the guidance? I was just thinking about, like you mentioned, change control. That's a pretty relatively new kind of concept with AI, especially and whatnot. So you ever sometimes get in front of the regulator and you're like, oh gosh, they don't know the guidance. I'm just thinking for some of the folks in the audience that obviously I think they want to really bone up on what they're about to ask FDA and know that guidance inside and out. But I'm kind of curious from your experience if sometimes you're working with a regulator and like, oh geez, they maybe don't know the guidance and I'll have to kind of walk them through it.
Yeah, so I haven't had that, and I talked about it earlier, the way I address it is because I tell FDA what I'm following when I give that, right? So if I'm gonna rely on a guidance in a submission or in change control, I've told FDA what I'm basing my strategy off of. So they should already know that I'm using this new guidance that they've put out to give this. And so they've looked at it, and I will say FDA, they're really good professionals. They're often very up to date on their guidance. And so I don't encounter that, but I do account for that by making it very explicit what guidance I'm relying on whenever I use it. So.
Any others in the audience? Let's see if there's any.
All right, thank you. Well, I will turn it over to Amanda.
Hello. Oh, it worked. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here and everybody online. My name is Amanda Johnston. I'm a partner at Gardner Law, and I split my practice between healthcare compliance and regulatory affairs. So help with developing compliance programs, advising on commercial programs, and then I also help with regulatory strategies, submissions, in FDA interactions, work a lot with Nate on those topics. But today I'm going to talk about enforcement trends. So specifically in the False Claims Act area, and I'll give a kind of a brief overview, and then we'll also walk through some case studies or some examples of cases just to give you a sense of the types of themes and trends that we're seeing. So I will provide a recap of the DOJ's last year. They just released data on settlements and judgments from a False Claims Act perspective. We'll talk about 3 of the key themes that we're seeing. We'll also provide some key takeaways and best practices for FDA-regulated companies. All right, so in February, the DOJ announced their summary for fiscal year 2023. And so I have a bunch of statistics here for you, but we'll walk through them. So they had a record year in a couple respects. The False Claims Act settlements and judgments, recoveries from those in fiscal year 2023 exceeded $2.68 billion, 2/3 of which is from the healthcare industry, so $1.8 billion. We saw a record number of settlements and judgments at 543. And we saw a record number of new False Claims Act matters opened with 1,012. So these have been continuing to rise, but those two really bring home the fact that the DOJ is continuing to use the False Claims Act as one of their best tools for combating fraud and abuse. Whistleblower suits continue to be a very high proportion of these matters. There have been 712 whistleblower suits filed in 2023. That turns out to about 13 new cases per week, which is crazy to think about. The government collected $2.3 billion related to whistleblower cases, and they paid out $349 million to whistleblowers. So takeaway on this kind of update from the DOJ, they're continuing to focus on the healthcare industry. They're continuing to focus on whistleblowers and intervention in whistleblower cases. I think the percentage was 81% of the cases filed in 2023, the government intervened on. 87% of the recoveries, so of that $2.68 billion, were whistleblower cases. So they're going to continue to focus on whistleblower cases. They're going to continue to focus on the healthcare industry. All right, so these statistics are high level. They show us some themes in terms of how things are going, increasing mostly, but wanted to dig a little bit deeper and look at some of the cases and some of the topics, because that's what really is going to help companies prepare for having a good compliance program and trying to mitigate these risks as best you can. So I took a sampling of cases that we're going to walk through just to give you a feel for kind of from a med tech, pharma, medical device perspective, where the enforcement focuses have been. And it will be no surprise that one of the key focuses is the anti-kickback statute, so unlawful kickbacks. All right, so the first case is Modern Vascular. This was a complaint that was filed in December 22. It's actually still ongoing. The complaint alleges that Modern Vascular would offer investment opportunities to doctors in exchange for referrals to their lab-based clinics. In addition, the owner of these lab-based clinics pressured surgeons to increase the number of surgeries and set very aggressive targets for their employees. This actually has, if you look up this case, there's a lot of patients that are claiming they're actually filing civil suits against the company for unnecessary surgeries. The company filed for bankruptcy, and Medicare has suspended payments to Modern Vascular. So this one is still ongoing, but the theme is offering investments in exchange for referrals. We have the cardiac imaging case, which was settled in October of 23. They settled for $85.5 million to resolve allegations that it paid kickbacks to consultants. So it was cardiologist consultants. They engaged them to supervise imaging and PET scans. And the government alleges that the fees provided for those supervision services were above fair market value. So again, we're looking at engaging consultants. Fair market value is important. And in some cases, with this, in the complaint, they allege that the cardiologists were actually not in the building or not in the room during these supervising visits. So there may have been some kind of improper or services not actually rendered as well. Carter Healthcare. So this is October 22. They settled for $22.9 million to resolve allegations that it improperly paid doctors under the guise of a medical directorship. So they had engaged several doctors to act as medical directors. The argument or the allegation is that they didn't actually perform those services or they didn't actually earn those titles. So again, kind of the theme here is providing value in exchange for inducement, whether it's indirect or direct. All right, a couple EHR cases or settlements that we've seen. So these are electronic health record vendors. The first one is Modernizing Medicine in 22. They agreed to pay $45.5 million for kickbacks. Allegedly, they were providing cash and other incentives for referrals for other hospital facilities to use their EHR program. And they also donated EHR services, and the government viewed those as a kickback. One of the key points here, though, is that the EHR system actually failed to meet certain specifications from a security standpoint. And the next case actually has kind of a similar fact pattern. So NextGen Healthcare, that was in July of last year, they agreed to pay $31.2 million. In this case, they were misrepresenting the capability of its software and its security aspects, and they were also incentivizing referrals with credits. There were sporting tickets, entertainment tickets to boost sales. So those two, we've seen kind of a trend of EHR settlements and prosecutions and enforcement actions, most of which have a flavor of kickback, but also have some issues with the capabilities or the specifications of the actual EHR system. Arthrex, I wanted to throw a few in here from a couple of years back. So Arthrex was in 2021. This was a $16 million settlement, involved royalty payments. So the government alleged that the royalty agreements that the doctors had entered into with Arthrex were not earned, essentially, that they did not provide enough contributions to the design or the development of a product to get the royalty payments. So they viewed them as a kickback. And then we have Kaleo from 2021 as well. And this one's interesting because it tells us that the government sees prior authorizations as claims to the federal healthcare program. So essentially, Kaleo was sending prescriptions to a preferred pharmacy, and that pharmacy was submitting prior authorization requests containing misrepresentations. Allegedly, Kaleo knew about it and didn't do anything. The specialty pharmacy also settled as well under the False Claims Act. So kind of a random sampling of different types of False Claims Act, anti-kickback statute flavors here. And then we have a few other tales of fraud and other enforcement actions. Of course, COVID fraud, we've seen the FDA and the DOJ has been focused on combating fraud in the COVID pandemic space. Just this month, or actually last month, it's May 1st now, there was a CEO that was sentenced to 7 years in prison for a securities fraud scheme. He claimed that he had developed a COVID-19 test that took 15 seconds. He had misled investors. He misled others about whether they had submitted and obtained FDA approval. He used fake personas for deception. So this one's, more of a egregious kind of fraud, run-of-the-mill fraud, but also in the area. If anyone, so the Philips Respironics kind of saga, they've had quite a journey over the last few years, but just recently the court ordered Philips Respironics to stop manufacturing at 3 of their Pennsylvania sites due to non-compliance with GMPs and for distributing misbranded and adulterated products. So Philips has had, I think, 3 warning letters. They have a consent decree. They have had multiple recalls. So civil lawsuits. This most recent court injunction was related to, based on the pleadings, related to failure to validate the remediation efforts. So presumably under the consent decree and the warning letters, they have a lot of remediation efforts going on. And the allegation is that they failed to validate the process for remediation, and they also failed to inform FDA of some corrections and removals that they conducted. Family Dollar, I don't know if anybody heard about this one in the news. It's really grosses me out. But this one, Family Dollar in February agreed to pay $41.7 million, and they pled guilty to adulteration. So they had a rodent infestation at their distribution center. And it sounds, if you're interested, you can read the complaint. It sounds disgusting. They had feces and nests everywhere. And when FDA came in and inspected, they had it fumigated and they found like 1,200 rodents in their distribution center. So they had to recall all of their FDA-regulated products. Yeah. So it kind of harkens back to the Park Doctrine, or the US v. Park case, where the responsible corporate officer doctrine was born, where they also had a rodent infestation. So it'll be interesting to see if there are any responsible corporate officers that are held responsible for this. All right, so some more FDA fraud. So just recently, a former regulatory affairs specialist, and I don't think they gave the company name, but it was in Massachusetts. So this is an RAS at a company. He was just recently sentenced to 12 months in prison for forging FDA clearance letters. He actually never submitted anything. He created letters, had the seal of the FDA on them, and shared them with his management team and said, yep, we're good to go. So he was sentenced to prison. That's a big deal. It was high-speed surgical drills. I mean, that's pretty crazy to not have FDA clearance for those type of products. And then I'm going to skip down to last. Delore Technologies was, again, more of a recent case. Kind of a similar situation, except they didn't fabricate approval letters, but they were selling a nerve block device for migraines. They were also encouraging improper billing codes for customers. They never actually submitted to the FDA. The CEO was actually charged criminally and pled guilty in this case. And then kind of jumping back to the biotelemetry and LifeWatch case. This was just recently in December. So this one's interesting. They have a cardiac monitoring system. There's 3 levels of monitoring that you can choose from, or the provider can choose from. The allegations are that they've used deceptive ordering and sales techniques to try to get the provider to select the telemetry option, which was higher reimbursement. So this one's interesting that they went so far as to look at the sales and ordering tactics. But essentially it's misleading customers. They caused false claims to be submitted. All right, that's my case overview. So if we look at kind of all those cases, and again, those are just a sampling to try to pick out the main themes that we're seeing. We also want to look at the ongoing investigations, and we can look at publicly available sources. You know, you can Google, you can look on the SEC database and find if certain companies are under investigation or if they've received a CID. You can kind of glean some information from SEC filings. So looking at kind of the publicly available information from those sources, as well as the last couple of years of False Claims Act, DOJ enforcement activity, we can glean 3 enforcement themes, and these are probably not a surprise. The most common, or the most prevalent theme is False Claims Act, primarily related to reimbursement that's submitted for services that weren't actually provided or not medically necessary. So this is primarily in the provider space. We're actually seeing an uptick in off-label promotion being involved in False Claims Act investigations as it relates to submitting claims to the government. We've seen a few in settlements, but there's a couple more kind of trickling in with current investigations. Deception and misrepresentations, we saw a few examples of those in the cases. Obviously, that's not surprising. When it comes to the anti-kickback statute, so of course, if there is a kickback violation, it will always be accompanied by a False Claims Act violation. So the False Claims Act is going to show up most often, but anti-kickback statute, the DOJ is looking at, and this has kind of continued to be the case, but they're looking at financial incentives, whether direct or indirect, benefits. We've seen a few cases now where they are specifically looking at payments for consulting services over fair market value, and services that weren't actually rendered that they're getting paid for. So whether it's a retainer agreement, so just gives you an idea of those two kind of more subtopics, more specific subtopics under the AKS topic. And then the third is billing and reimbursement. Again, that goes along, these are all kind of overlapping and woven together, but really looking at legitimacy and accuracy of claims and coding. More on the provider side, but as companies, medtech, pharma companies, anyone in the space, we need to be careful that we are providing accurate guidance and not providing recommendations that would result in improper coding or upcoding or unbundling or bundling. We've seen those themes in the last couple of years. So from a takeaway perspective, DOJ is continuing to focus on the healthcare industry. That's clear. 2/3 of their recoveries this last year were from the healthcare industry. So not only is it, bringing in money, but it also, they're focused on protecting the public health. Whistleblower suits are continuing to rise. We've seen a few programs released by the DOJ. One is a pilot self-disclosure program and one is a whistleblower program. They're continuing to raise the stakes on trying to get internal folks to report issues. So the DOJ pilot on the self-disclosure just recently came out, and it actually will, even if you are involved in the criminal conduct, they're inviting you or asking you to report. There's some pretty strict criteria in terms of how you have to cooperate and what you have to provide, but they may offer some immunity or potentially a non-prosecution agreement in some cases. So this is a new one. Even if you're involved in the criminal actions, you could potentially get credit under this DOJ pilot. And then the previous, or actually not previous, but it was already in existence, is the whistleblower program that the DOJ has. So not only do whistleblowers, potentially collect 1/3 of the recoveries if the government intervenes, the whistleblower program is actually saying that they will give you in financial rewards over and above that if you come forward and if you meet certain criteria. So this creates an environment where we have, the government is telling employees to raise concerns. Hopefully they're raising concerns internally first. It creates an environment where they're being heavily incentivized to speak up if they see something wrong, not only financially, but also they could potentially get immunity even if they were involved in the conduct. No surprise that anti-kickback statute, False Claims Act is the predominant area of enforcement over the last couple of years. I mentioned off-label promotion is actually making a little bit of a comeback, as we've seen in some of the False Claims Act settlements and some of the investigations that are going on. Again, not from an FDA perspective necessarily, although they may be involved, but more from a False Claims Act perspective in the sense that if a company is promoting off-label, it's going to cause the submission of claims that the government could view as false because it's inconsistent with the device or product's approved indication. If there are patient safety issues or if there's a potential for patient harm with any compliance concern that comes up, that's what's going to get the government's attention. So we've seen a lot more kind of egregious or aggressive enforcement where there's issues that could result in patient harm. So just being laser focused and, if there's ever a potential for patient harm, follow your QMS, do the right thing in terms of trying to make corrections in that respect. That should drive everything. And of course, billing accuracy is critical. It always has been, but especially in the lab space and the DME space, focusing on medical necessity and ensuring that proper coding practices are being adhered to and complying with applicable guidance as it relates to coding. So best practices. Ride with a strong compliance crew. So this is not new again. The government expects everybody to have a compliance program, but make sure that you are creating and investing and dedicating resources to a robust compliance program. It's not just a packet of documents or policies that you have that you route in your system and then just sit there and no one ever looks at. It has to actually be functioning and effective. And it's okay to find issues and uncover compliance issues. That means that the program is working, and that's how you would demonstrate that your program is effective. So thinking of kind of the whistleblower trends and the incentives there, if a employer or somebody external raises an issue, take it seriously, follow it through your process, do an investigation. That's exactly what you'd be able to, that shows that your program is working. So that is really the most important piece. Keep your marketing spurs aligned. So just again, we're seeing a little bit more off-label stuff come up, and not necessarily from an FDA perspective necessarily, but make sure that your claims and your materials and your messaging, both on paper and what your sales reps are saying, make sure that they're aligned with the FDA cleared or approved uses, indications, contraindications, warnings, all that kind of stuff, and make sure that your claims are appropriately substantiated. Audit the trail regularly. So performing routine audits and monitoring. Monitoring comes pretty naturally if you have a compliance person or a function at your company, but routine audits seem to be more of a thing that you forget about until it comes time to like submit your Nevada compliance audit form, and then you kind of quickly do one. So audits should be focused to the risks of your company. So in order to get kind of the most bang for your buck, you don't want to go out and do, a huge audit every year, but really thinking about where your risk areas are and focusing audit activities on those. That's what the government wants to see, and it also makes sense from a business efficiency perspective that you're not going to be spending time and money and resources in areas where you won't make an impact from a risk perspective if you do find stuff. So just even setting aside, time at the beginning of every year or during the budgeting period to plan out some sort of an audit, just having that placeholder in there, it really is important, and the government expects us to do it. Compliance quests, so providing comprehensive compliance training to all staff. And so this is regular compliance training. So, at the time of hire is great, but that's, they're basically drinking from a fire hose on those first few weeks, and they probably are not retaining all of the information. So following up with kind of the new hire training, if there's different manners or methods of training that would work, whether it's read and acknowledge or some sort of a quiz or having a live training or a video training. And then also providing ad hoc training as needed to address specific risks. Again, this should be a risk-based approach to address the highest risk for the company. Kind of the key takeaway from a False Claims Act and a kickback statute perspective is we really have to focus and closely scrutinize any arrangements where healthcare professionals or healthcare entities could be getting some sort of a benefit. So whether you are creating a new program or you're assessing the existing commercial program, whether it's a discount arrangement or some new innovative service model, really look closely to try to find out where those remunerative streams are. So who is getting benefit and not only before you start the program, but also as, maybe a few months in, check for themes. Have sales gone way up? If yes, let's take a look and it's great, but let's see if there's some underlying incentive that we missed. So just continuing to closely scrutinize any type of arrangement with healthcare professionals, anytime there's money or value transferring. Stay on top of the regulatory rodeo. So just keep tabs on, like you guys are doing, coming to these types of programs, keeping up to speed with enforcement trends, settlements, networking, and just kind of hearing and learning from other colleagues in the space. That really helps inform and educate, and helps you prepare the company to be ready and proactive from a healthcare compliance perspective. Any questions?
Hey, thank you. So looking at the slides, it seems like the same enforcement playbook that's been going on now for years, and the numbers just keep going up.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of questions from a law firm perspective, and just what you're learning in the market. Like, number one, why do you see us continuing to still have these problems when these issues have been around for decades now? And why do you see the growth? If there's any kind of maybe impression you get.
Yeah.
And then two, are you seeing any sort of novel techniques in addressing these things?
Mm-hmm.
Just curious what you're seeing if you've got clients that are doing things creatively.
Yeah, absolutely. And any other colleagues, feel free to jump in. I think the government is everything's continuing to rise and increase. I mean, there are more and more innovative technologies out there. There's startups. We've seen a lot of growth in this space, specifically med tech. So I do think that's probably part of it. The whistleblower cases, I think part of it's going to be the incentives. I mean, they're being financially incentivized. There's no retaliation. I think that's definitely part of it, but also the government, it's profitable for them. They get to the healthcare industry. Last year they collected $1.8 billion. So it keeps them employed, I believe. Is anyone else? I don't know if anyone at Gardner has thoughts on that. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, so he was saying the DOJ is viewed more as law enforcement. It's not a partisan issue. So we don't have, one side or the other saying, yeah, exactly.
I think one thing too is a lot of individuals who aren't as used to being in a heavily regulated industry like the FDA are entering it. And so, there's a little bit of laxness there that they're used to being able to quote unquote do what they want. And that can get into some difficult areas, especially when it comes to devices and types of claims you want to make, and then you get on market, and then you push the envelope a little bit, and FDA and DOJ get upset by that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think one other thing is, there's a lot of pressure put on sales and marketing,
Mm-hmm.
and we've seen it time and time again where you have a company that comes out of the gates, they do really well. They've got a huge marketing push, huge sales push. They've hired all the right people to get the sales going. And then payers go, oh my gosh, look at this spike. We got to tamp down on this. So then sales get affected. So then sales and marketing kind of doubles down. Now we're going to do more. And I think that the pressures that are put on people, and it's not just your territory manager, it goes to the top of the company. It could be the CEO, because they're like, hey, I have investors,
Mm-hmm.
got Wall Street. And it's like this vicious cycle. And sometimes what happens is it then crashes. And the sales reps are all like, why are you firing me? I did what you told me to.
Right.
And they're like, well, I guess I'll go talk to the government, even if I have to kind of gin something up a bit or make it, more than it really is. We saw that with like Hard Roots case, Vascular Solutions.
Mm-hmm.
you've read his book, it's interesting. But you know, there's in that case, there's a financial setup, as Matt pointed out, for the fired rep who's like, I'm scorned, and there's a payday, and the government's over here going, hey, we will pay you for tips, right? So, and I was really impressed with the over 80% that they joined. That's really wild.
Yep.
So yeah, I think it keeps happening because there's incentives, and the government's also like, this is a really successful industry. It costs taxpayers a lot of money. We know that there's, what is there, like 8%, I think is the number that's quoted fraud in CMS annually around there. So they're like, we're just going to keep throwing assets at it. Plus, if you're working in justice or OIG, it's a great way to get promoted, I think. Settling cases,
that's true. Yep.
prosecuting companies, if you have other aspirations, that's a way to advance your career. So yeah, I think I don't think it's going away. And it seems to be, actually, as we see a record number of cases here initiated, it's definitely going up. And I always get nervous if I see like economic warning signs coming for our clients, because if the market starts to drop, that means everything I just talked about, it's like, it's like a fire on, or a gas on the fire. So a couple comments.
And then the second part of your question was just kind of what things are we seeing clients, or are we advising clients to do? I mean, one thing, and I mentioned one of the key takeaways was really looking at those remunerative streams. And that is one thing that we've been helping clients do a lot lately, is deep diving into certain programs. The OIG has their facts and circumstances test, and I really like to use that and walk through each kind of test and spend some time thinking of arguments for and against, and like really diving deep in those details. A lot of the times, you're missing potentially, a program may sound completely compliant and fine and common, but once you dig down in the weeds and learn more about reimbursement or relationships between referral physicians and doctors, you'll see that maybe there is actually some sort of a connection there. We also, audits, we help clients with audits a lot, whether it's a focused audit specific on certain topics that are key risk areas for them, or more of a comprehensive compliance program audit. Encouraging ride-alongs and having the compliance team kind of build rapport with the company, so that it's not the sales prevention team, it's actually, a collaborating partner. Just some of the things that I've seen kind of the trends going that way is, trying to get a good handle on it and mitigate risk for the company.
We have one more question.
Are you seeing any kind of increase of scrutiny for direct to patient or direct to consumer marketing by companies that then benefits a physician, and then also programs for patient access and insurance pre-qualification, those programs that some companies provide? And then a second question, which is off the kind of in a different direction, is I think the OJ came out last year with some guidance or kind of a directive that post-acquisition, the acquiring company has 6 months to throw you under the bus.
Yep.
and they get a pass. And are you seeing any companies that are sort of in the acquirer group that have started to go and have a sort of post-closing process to go and scrub, actual activities in hoping to get under that that directive?
So I'll start with that one just because it's fresh on my mind. We help a lot of companies with diligence, whether it's buying or selling, and we haven't seen, when that came out, it was just a little surprising to me, but we haven't seen a change in kind of the focus of due diligence, whether it's before or after. I have not, I don't know if anyone else, I haven't worked with a company that was like, okay, we need to get in with the 6 months, because they don't want to throw themselves under the bus either. So I haven't seen changes, and I haven't heard of changes based on that specifically. Direct to consumer marketing, I don't know, Nate, you can talk to that, but patient access programs, we haven't seen any like settlements, investigations related to them specifically, but they're very common. I think they're increasing. Given just the cost of healthcare and reimbursement rates and payers, there's issues with prior auth and coverage, just slowing down the process. We've seen an uptick for sure in companies that are looking for ways to facilitate access for the patients, whether it's covering certain pieces or giving discounts, that kind of a thing. Definitely seen an increase in that. And then he had asked about direct to patient or direct to consumer marketing.
Yeah, so I've certainly seen an increased focus on that. One thing I really focus on in advising clients is make it clear, very clear, if you have a physician involved in that, to highlight they're paid, not a hashtag ad or hashtag partner, right? Clearly disclose financial relationships, which FTC really focused on last summer, and we've all seen that. Lots of letters have come from that, and so to me, that's one of the biggest focuses. Hey, I want to do this. Can I put a physician in this lens? Can I use their name? Can I use their practice? And then, how do I disclose? And so, being very clear, making sure you're not promoting the physician, making sure the physician's not getting value, if there's a story there. And then, the typical things though that also come with DTC advertising of, fair balance with the clinical message, right? It's hard for consumers to understand clinical messaging. And, there was a letter by senators that was issued recently basically saying, hey, FDA, are you going to look more into this? So that could trigger something too, right? So there's multiple ways that companies can get in trouble with DTC advertising. So, I've seen more scrutiny, a lot more questions around that. So
I was going to add, Nate, just to kind of tag on to what you said there. So we just wrote an article on this. It's on our website if you want to check it out. But a couple senators are complaining to FDA that they're not doing enough to regulate DTCA, direct to consumer advertising. And so when we were putting that alert out, Nate and I were talking about this, we're like, some of our clients are going to be looking at this going, are you kidding? Really? We need more regulation on these consumer ads? There's already an incredible amount, especially on the pharma side of the equation. It's a little more relaxed on the device side compared to the drug side. So yeah, it's tough to be in this industry, get it from all sides, right? So thank you, Amanda.
All right, thanks guys. I'll pass it over to Paul. Thanks.
Good morning.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Can you hear me all right here? Great. If you have been sitting for an hour like me, you're probably wanting to stretch for a second. So feel free to do that right as we get started here, but take a moment to do that if you need. I'm Paul Rothermel. I'll advance so you can see me. I'll be talking about privacy laws today. So everyone here is probably familiar at some level with HIPAA, and we know that that is not directly applicable to manufacturers generally. However, we'll talk about some exceptions to that. We'll talk about briefly some examples of state privacy laws that impact how companies in this space must comply, including in direct-to-consumer marketing, things of that nature. And then we'll give some case studies, and that's where I want to spend a couple of minutes at the end, is talking about some real-world examples of how privacy can really drive and affect business approaches to things like marketing, patient support, and then even things like FDA adverse event reporting and things like that. So we'll talk through those today. Here's my picture. As Nate said, you can see me live. Probably a better example. So my background is just in privacy through in-house roles in government, working at large med device manufacturer, and then most recently Gardner Law, of course. So again, we'll talk about HIPAA briefly, just some highlights I think are really important for us to be reminded of or know as manufacturing businesses, and then some state privacy law implications. We won't cover all the state privacy laws. There's, as you might know, 16 state privacy laws that are comprehensive in scope since the CCPA in California was passed 6 or so years ago. So we're well on the way to having one in every state. So that's wonderful. And we have one more that's on the threshold in Maryland. So lots of activity there, some navigation of those rules, and then case studies. So let's get in. So as you know, lots of state privacy laws. In fact, here in Texas, we recently had the Texas Data Privacy and Security Act. There's a number of other privacy laws throughout the country that are on the books or else in legislatures and likely to pass. So we have a lot of activity in that front. At the same time, HIPAA continues from 1996 till now to impact the healthcare industry in direct ways or even indirect ways, as we experience on our end of things in the industry. And then of course now we have to deal with both of these things. We have, on the one hand, we have to satisfy customers and their HIPAA compliance efforts, and we also have to address now laws that directly impact internal activities and other work that we do on the industry side. So just a brief overview again of HIPAA. I don't want to go deep into this. We don't have time to do that, but for the most part, HIPAA is a law that's intended to affect insurance and insurance-related activity. So if you are selling a product to a company that, or to a practice, to a provider, that provider is billing insurance. They're covered by HIPAA. The insurance plan is covered by HIPAA. But if you sell a product to an organization covered by HIPAA, that does not automatically make your company subject to HIPAA. So that goes into the concept of covered entities and business associates. If you've heard these phrases, really what that means is a covered entity is a healthcare provider that bills insurance electronically directly, or it's a health insurance plan, or what's called a healthcare clearinghouse, and that's a company that processes information for these entities. And then business associates, and that's more often what we see med device manufacturers and drug companies dealing with, is this business associate idea that's a service provider to a covered entity. And of course, this excludes most manufacturers at their base level. They might do activities, which we'll get into in a moment, that cross over into some of those functions, but generally, they're not going to deal with the HIPAA regulations directly. PHI, I'm sure everyone's heard that thrown around, protected health information, PHI. Most of the time, a manufacturer will not be dealing with PHI in the strict sense. They'll handle health information. They'll handle various pieces of patient information, but generally, it's not PHI when it's handled by a manufacturer unless there's a business associate agreement involved, unless you're a covered entity. So that's a term that gets kind of thrown around and is really strictly about data managed and maintained and used by a HIPAA covered entity. So there are requirements for these organizations, and we generally break those down into privacy rule, security rule, and breach notification rule. But again, those only apply to covered entities and business associates. So a couple of examples that we see in this area. Covered entities can include things like durable medical equipment manufacturers. You know, as you know, they typically will sell a product that's used by an individual. They'll bill insurance directly for that product in most cases. That can make that entity a covered entity and obligated to follow HIPAA requirements. Covered entity is again directly regulated by HIPAA. And laboratories, if they're involved in, you know, doing tests, maybe it's a laboratory developed test or some other device, that could potentially implicate a covered entity status as well, depending on the arrangements. So as you can imagine, most manufacturers don't fall in these categories, but those that do have those implications. Business associate functions are a little bit more widespread. I think a common example that we see, and I'll jump to the second bullet here, reimbursement or product support programs, ways that you can interact with your customers to do prior authorizations, do patient access, can, not always, can involve a business associate relationship. And that, of course, then HIPAA flows down and addresses that handling of information. Another common example in the device space especially, but it could overflow in other med tech sectors, is connected products or services that process personal information from a covered entity for a covered entity. You know, maybe you're delivering reports through the cloud or downloading information to the cloud that's stored on behalf of that covered entity. Generally, again, not always, that will involve signing business associate agreements, or at least discussing that, if not signing them. So of course, most of the time, we're not dealing with PHI at the manufacturer level. We're maybe receiving PHI in the sense that it's patient information. So there are a number of exceptions that allow that information to flow without a BAA, a business associate agreement, and that would be, for example, treatment, a very common exception. There's federal guidance that indicates, okay, there's a certain level of access to PHI that's appropriate for a manufacturer related to treatment activities, healthcare operations and payment, sort of broader buckets, less common, but payment definitely applies where we have billing and invoicing, and maybe there's some necessity to exchange some limited patient information to address payment issues. Business associates, of course, so if there's a service provider that needs access to PHI, you sign a business associate agreement and that PHI can be disclosed to that business associate. So a manufacturer might fall in that bucket. Patient authorization, really common way to share PHI. It's kind of the catch-all. If there's not any other way to do this through the exceptions, you'll see a patient authorization approach. And then public health. So this is a broad category, but one that we deal with a lot on the manufacturing side is FDA regulatory requirements require certain kinds of information gathering, whether it's for patient registration purposes or adverse event reporting requirements. There needs to be some level of collection of this data, and the manufacturer has the ability to do that through this exception. And so patient authorization, I'd like to mention this because there's some specific requirements around patient authorization in HIPAA. It's a form of consent, but it has select elements that need to be implemented for that authorization to be adequate and effective. So it's important to go and look at the regs and evaluate consent that you collect so that your customer can comply and provide that information in a compliant manner to you. Again, when it comes to marketing, sale of PHI, and when we talk about patient marketing, anytime there's a collaboration with a physician where there might be PHI from a covered entity used in marketing, then there are some issues potentially, and that's a critical point of note, that it's prohibited to use PHI or disclose it for marketing activities without patient authorization or unless certain exceptions apply. And that's an unusual scenario that those exceptions do apply. It's a very limited activity. And of course, purchasing PHI directly is also prohibited without directly getting patient consent to do that. Business associates, so there are some brief requirements here we'll cover, but basically a business associate signs an agreement with the covered entity. They have to agree to certain kinds of requirements that involve data security. HIPAA is very detailed about data security requirements. And then also typically those agreements involve other things that the covered entity thinks are important. So things like insurance levels for cybersecurity, breach liability, kind of coverage, different things that are in the covered entity's view, necessary to mitigate their risk in the arrangement. And you'll see that business associates are typically not allowed to use PHI then for really other purposes. So things like new product development. You can't just take the PHI that's borrowed from the covered entity to do the services and then use it for your own purposes. There's some restrictions on that as well. So that's HIPAA in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it, but just to kind of high level understand, this is how this applies. But as you can see, often it does not impact what manufacturers are doing. And so we want to talk about what other things do apply. And we won't go into all of the things that do apply. There are many federal regulations. The FTC is interested in privacy right now and doing a lot on that front. But state privacy laws, which are newer and have a lot of impacts, have really driven compliance activities. So just a couple of examples here we'll go through. One is that I think is really impactful is the Washington My Health, My Data Act, as it's called. This past last year, came into effect March 31st of this year for most entities. And then the California Consumer Privacy Act, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, just as a great kind of ground rule example of comprehensive privacy law. The focus generally of the My Health, My Data Act is consumer health data. And the reason I mention this one in particular is it doesn't have any exceptions based on entity size, volume of data processed. It's really just any entity that does business in Washington involving Washington resident information and then handles it. Okay, there's some rules that are going to apply. So it's very broad in its scope and it's very specific in some of the requirements. And we'll go over a couple of those in a minute here. Then the CCPA, very comprehensive. It's covering all health or all information, health or not, really, that's collected in California or about Californians that relates to an individual that's identifiable. And that's it's a very broad definition. The good news is many states exclude HIPAA protected information or entities from them. The bad news is each state does this a little bit differently. So each state has its own way of excluding this, whether it's at the data level or the entity level. And so or both. And so that's important to pay attention to which kind of exception are you dealing with when dealing with health information or patient information. And it's also key to note that HIPAA does preempt state law in some respects, but if that state law does apply and is more stringent in its privacy protections than HIPAA, it's going to override and elevate the floor that HIPAA sets. So there is an element of necessity to pay attention to that too. So just one example, we'll do this briefly because there isn't time to go through all 17 laws, but we'll do just this one example and do a high level overview of some of the things that it requires. So any entity that collects, and I'll explain collects in a second, but collects consumer health data in Washington, so about Washington residents, is subject to this law. It's very broad. Collect does not mean what you would think it means. It means to basically do anything with the information, whether it's collecting it, buying, renting, accessing, retaining, receiving, acquiring, inferring. I keep going back through my finger. There's a lot of things, but it covers any kind of processing or activity that involves that consumer health data. And consumer health data is also a broad definition that covers things that you wouldn't necessarily consider health information typically. So it is a broad definition. And some of the privacy requirements here are echoes, just strains of things that you might have heard of in HIPAA, but maybe implemented differently or in a more broad way. So we have requirements to provide privacy notices. That really is like something you post to your website or inside mobile applications that might collect personal information. These involve disclosures that are specific to how do you use, how do you share, how do you process this information, and for what purposes, what kinds of information are being processed. So we often see charts that outline this and are included in these privacy notices. To obtain explicit consent before certain kinds of sharing or certain kinds of use of consumer health data. And then a new kind of thing to think about is, do you have agreements that address data processing with vendors? So do you have a vendor that's going to handle some of this information? Does your agreement cover various privacy elements that are written out in this law? So there's a level of this control. And this is not unique to this particular privacy law. That's become just universal. We see that in all sorts of these laws, but that's an element. There are various rights that patients have or individuals have to access their data, to delete it, to review it, to have it information shared about what exactly is happening with that information. And then appeal rights on top of that if they disagree with the approach you've taken. And of course, data security is outlined in this law as well. And then one unique thing that we're seeing in this and a couple of other state laws is geofencing restrictions when it relates to healthcare services, especially around reproductive health, but other kind of broad categories are restricted as well. And that involves, so if someone goes to a healthcare service location, maybe a clinic, if you're tracking their entry into that kind of band where a GPS locator is identifying, hey, they've been to this service location, you're not allowed to collect that information and process it based on some of these laws. So we have one example of a state law that I think is representative in many ways of the state laws we're dealing with. How are these going to complement or supplement HIPAA requirements? So, as we all know, most manufacturers don't have to deal with HIPAA directly. It regulates covered entities and their business associates, but These laws are in the states right now and broadly are going to regulate personal information, even though HIPAA doesn't apply, even though we're not sort of used to seeing these regulations apply to this data. That's the case now. So this requires some evaluation. You know, for example, are there exceptions that allow our organization to receive PHI and from, you know, whether covered entities or business associates? Is there an exception within state laws that say, okay, it's PHI, we're not going to have to deal with state law because HIPAA applies here? Identify those states and what those laws specifically say. It does change based on the state, potentially. And then, is the company a business associate or covered entity when it comes to this data? Okay, we have an exception, it's PHI, we're a business associate. That can be a easy, okay, we have HIPAA to comply with, we don't have to deal with these state laws, great. On the other hand, you know, if this data is received through patient authorization, maybe it's received through adverse event reporting or some other function, or it's directly collected from the patient and there's no HIPAA covered entity involved at all, well, then we might have some alternative law that we have to address at the state level that directly tells us how to interact with that patient, maybe how to provide proper notice, get consent, those kinds of things. So the key point here that I'm trying to make is HIPAA compliance for you or for your business, you know, for your business partners does not equal state law compliance. They are different and they apply to different sets of data, and they apply different rules about who is responsible for giving notice to patients, who's responsible for getting consent, and then ultimately who is responsible for the processing and accountable to regulators. So we'll do a couple quick case studies here. I think this one is something I'm seeing more and more. We're seeing companies in an attempt to reach patients, to help their patients through whether it's complex pathways to navigate their care and get treatment, whether it's to get more data and understand their patient population better or what feedback patients have for the company. They're building things like these patient apps. So in this example, we have a drug manufacturer, and we'll call them Acme. Know if it relates in any way to a real company, that's not intended, of course. But a drug manufacturer designs a patient-facing app, and this helps patients better understand their therapy, give feedback to the company. Acme is not a covered entity, they're not a business associate, but the app collects patient information, and there's a variety of things we have listed here. The patient information is collected directly from them by Acme, so there's a direct link to that patient, and Acme is planning to share this information with the patient's primary care doctor through this web-based portal they've set up to help facilitate some sharing. And we'll assume this is all FDA approved, there's no concerns there, we're focused on the privacy issues. So within this, they're also planning to maybe use that patient information for future purposes. We've got this plan for, you know, a couple of years down the road, we're gonna go back, pick up this data set and do some product improvement evaluation and so on. What kind of issues do you think are here? And I'll answer my own questions here, but I just want to talk through some of the potential issues. So would we say here, HIPAA applies this information? Well, no, because this company is not a business associate. They're not a covered entity. So we have to evaluate what other laws might apply. And naturally, we could look to things like the Washington My Health, My Data Act and evaluate what applicability does this have? Do we have any patients in Washington, any other states that have privacy laws on the books? And then what kind of requirements are there? Do we need to provide notice during that initial kind of sign up to that patient in the app or on the website? What kind of things should be in that privacy notice, that privacy policy? Do we have data use restrictions? Are we able to take this data in and then use it for providing that initial service they sign up for? But what if later we have another use that we have in mind for this data set? Have we evaluated that now? Do we have consent to do that secondary use later? Or are we forced to stick with this primary use? These are things that the state privacy laws will address and will have impact on. What about things like data security? Are we off the hook because HIPAA doesn't apply? Well, no. These state privacy laws, not to mention the FTC are very interested in what kind of data security do we have. So that's a key element. What if a patient asks for access to information in this app? Again, HIPAA wouldn't apply, and it has privacy rights like this, but state laws do as well. So there's a new process, a new way to think about these sorts of data collection approaches and how to deal with these laws. All right, let's take another one. So in this case study, let's say we have same company, but they're expanding. They've purchased a manufacturing company of medical devices, and as part of that program that they're setting up, or that acquisition, they're setting up a new and improved FDA adverse event reporting program. So there's plenty of data that needs to come into this to collect feedback that might lead to an adverse event report. So you're getting complaint handling and all of these things involved. Patient information naturally is collected by this program. And so, of course, HIPAA permits that disclosure of PHI from this customer to Acme so that we have that covered. But what about the data use of this program? We have a lot of great data. It's, helps us understand what physicians are saying about these products, maybe even patients from time to time. Does HIPAA apply to this health information since it was provided by a covered entity? No, there's no business associate relationship. It's based on the public health exception. So again, there's no direct application of HIPAA to this data now that the manufacturer has it. Does that mean that it can be used for anything? Is there no limit on the use of this data? Can we just throw it into some copies of that data or draw it from that data to fill out our sales and marketing database? Again, no. So state law would say there may be an exception here to use this data for that purpose that HIPAA allows, but to use beyond that, we need to look at, is it in line with the appropriate use that was permitted by HIPAA originally? Does it go beyond the regulatory requirements the FDA has set up for adverse event reporting? So those are some things to think about and there's a lot of other considerations, but again, these are to illustrate how these laws do apply and what impact they can have really practically. So just a few quick takeaways before we wrap up here. So it's just want to drill this home. HIPAA is important. It does apply to customers of ours that deal with PHI daily. We want to address those requirements. We want to get patient authorizations, sign BAAs when needed, do those things, comply. But it doesn't address everything. We have a lot of state law requirements that do apply and impact us directly. HIPAA only applies to covered entities, and again, that is not going to include most manufacturers of drugs and devices. It's a much more narrow category, and it's focused. State privacy laws do apply to information handled by drug and device makers directly, and that's really where I think more enforcement activity might happen is as these laws mature and develop, being aware of how do we handle this information securely, how do we not misuse it in ways that are prohibited by these laws. And then lastly, security and privacy they're just way more than HIPAA. We have state regulators in California and other states that are starting to become active and starting to look at websites, at marketing activities, at use of patient data, and evaluating, is this appropriate, or is it in line with what you told the patient or the individual at the time you collected it? Is it beyond that? Did you give them proper notice or proper choice during the process of collecting that data to let them really own their data, which is really a concept we're seeing more. So that's really it here. Any questions? I'm happy to answer those.
Hey, Paul, I had a question on your example of the patient share of the app where the company then shares the information with the physician. And are there specific regulations when you've got consent from that patient to share the information with their healthcare provider? Is there anything there that we need to look into to understand what we have to do to allow for that sharing other than the patient consent?
Yeah, good question. So as a baseline, for the most part, sharing, so there's kind of two elements here that are key. So in the Washington Act in particular that we've talked about, if there's a kind of a notice provided. It's called like a notice of collection of consumer health data. If that covers that sharing and that approach and explains it, so here's the categories of information, here's who it will be shared with, categorically at least, and here's the kind of sharing the purpose of it. That usually is sufficient if the purpose of the sharing is tied to something the patient requests as a service. So that can relate to, I want to download this app so my provider can be involved. So you could get through that and say, okay, we have provided notice, kind of generally, we have them asking for a service and it's aligned with that, so we can share this data. If it goes beyond that, so maybe it's collected for some other purpose internally at the company, then consent would be something you'd look into to say, okay, we want to share this with the healthcare provider, maybe with another third party, for purposes outside of what the initially was disclosed and discussed with that patient, then the consent would really become relevant. Yeah, any other questions?
Hi, I just want to say this is super helpful for me because I am new to the medical device industry. I really appreciate the session. And you mentioned many state laws exclude HIPAA from their state privacy laws. It could be either from like a data level or from the entity level. How does it work? Say a company is a covered entity, but they have certain data that's subject to the state privacy law. I just wonder like how do they structure that, because it seems two different sets of data and therefore some data could be subject to the state privacy law whereas the other ones would be subject to HIPAA.
Yeah, good question. So this will vary by law. Let's just take, for example, one that regulates at the entity level. So typically what we'll see is, if you're a hospital or a healthcare provider, you're going to have patient data sets, and those are, for the most part, pretty clear. We have, a patient record, we have electronic health record. This data is patient data, and it's regulated by HIPAA directly. So that's going to be something you'll take into account as you, develop your security or privacy program, is what information is PHI, and defining that, classifying it as you do data inventory, as you evaluate what data is in the company. When you do that, you identify, okay, this is our PHI. Where it gets challenging is, okay, we have other information. Maybe we have employee information. Maybe we have consumer information that's outside of our patient records. Maybe it's website visitors, other things. Then you have to think about, okay, what sort of state laws might apply here, and that becomes the challenge, as there's so many state laws. But generally those state laws will say, okay, at the entity level. So then we look at, okay, is PHI excluded at the entity level, or in that law, or is it just the entity? And that entity level might broadly cover the whole entity, and you might look at data differently. It varies by state law. Where I've seen it get the most complex is when you have visitors to the website, or someone interacting with the website in a way that might involve some health-related information, and it's a covered entity. It's complex because HIPAA may or may not apply, and we have guidance from the federal government that we're supposed to infer an intent from patients to determine, or visitors to the website to determine if they're a patient or not. And that can create some complexity because state law and HIPAA do have different requirements. So when there's a gray area, that's where, getting legal counsel, getting input on that specific topic is really key. Great. Any last questions? Otherwise, I think I'll save some time. Here's Mark.
I'm going to ask one. Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you riff for a moment on? And I know I just want to hear from you on this. Like, some of these companies, sometimes they may take a position, I'm not a business associate, but I know you and I have talked about this, and you've gotten involved where you're like, even if you don't think you are, you're acting like one. And it might actually be easier for you to run your business as though you were. You know, and sometimes I know, I was just curious if you could riff on that for a moment, because I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts, latest thoughts.
Yeah. So, as you know, business associate is a entity that supports a covered entity and by providing a service generally. So it's whether that service is the examples in the law are things like consulting, advisory services, various, accounting, management. So different things that might involve access to PHI, to support billing or whatever. So if you're in those categories, it's really clear, right? So I'm an accountant and I'm providing service that involves access to PHI. Well, it's right in the reg that's part of a business associate's activity. A lot of things that med device companies do aren't explicitly laid out in the law, so they might do them on behalf of or in provision of service to a covered entity, but they look more like a treatment activity, or maybe it's something that we typically look at patient authorization as another way to do things like supporting a prior authorization, because maybe that's just on behalf of the patient that you're supporting. So those kinds of things can get more complex. What I would look at carefully is really, what drives this almost more than anything is covered entities' willingness to share information without a business associate agreement in place. And that's really what drives a lot of the decisions we have. So for example, your device might be connected to the cloud. You might have a device on site at a hospital or a clinic, and every time there's a programming event or something, it pumps data up into the cloud. This is not as common, but becoming more common as we advance and the technology gets better. In that scenario, you're going to have a hard time convincing your customer that you're not a business associate. That's just practically hard. They're going to say, what's the data flow? Well, it's on site and the data is going to the cloud through your systems. Okay, well they're going to want security and privacy and all those things considered, and they're going to say, this is our data. It's collected in our system. It's going to the cloud. So they'll want protection for that, and you're going to sign a BA in most cases. Other scenarios are a little more complex, and that's really where it becomes tricky to identify the balance. And I think it's so case by case. I would look to what is everyone else doing in this space, and can you do the same thing? Because that helps a lot. If other companies are successfully arguing, I'm not a business associate, we download some information, but it's mostly de-identified, we use it for something else, you can usually find ways to get through that, but it is a tricky topic.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
It's always good to be the person that breaks up conversation. Well, in order to stay on time, we'll start. I'm David Graham. I honored to have just joined the Gardner Law Firm in March. I spent my previous career litigating medical device, drug, mostly product liability cases. Then I did False Claims Act and other fraud cases, similar to what Amanda discussed. And I'm a food lawyer, but I won't explain that. But so I was thinking about topics related to litigation that weren't, anti-fraud cases. And so I thought, well, I don't want to just do a list of product liability cases because things don't always work and people get sued and that's not that interesting. And so I started looking closer at cases and decided that there were trends, none of which, I need to advance slides, don't I? There we go. Me. Right. And so I started reading cases, and I detected in the cases a breakdown of the balkanization of all the things upon which, as defendants and plaintiffs, we relied for the last 30 years. One of them is the learned intermediary doctrine. We'll talk about that later. We take it for granted. All our advertises based on saying a doctor has to be involved, and they're the gatekeepers. And so if we do everything right, we don't have to worry about being directly sued by consumers based on consumer fraud statutes, which all states have, and we'll talk about that more. And that's starting to deteriorate. Preemption, which says right in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that state laws that are different or add more requirements are preempted. But apparently, state courts in particular are starting to pick and choose more on that, and even some federal courts, and we'll talk about that more. And then the idea that the FDA is the authority or has the expertise, and they should interpret the laws, and those laws will turn into rules upon which we rely to do our work. I was thinking of Nate's presentation. All that stuff, right, is based on, well, the FDA knows what's going on. They collect the information about the devices and products that we're doing, and so they know the science, maybe not as well as the companies, but they try to keep up on it. And so if they interpret a statute in a way, there's been a doctrine called Chevron that you've probably heard about that keeps that interpretation as, at least in the face of an ambiguous law, as the one upon which the courts should rely instead of an interpretation of the litigants or its own, because some district court in Minnesota or somewhere else doesn't know about why the FDA made a certain rule or issued a certain guidance or something like that. So we'll talk about that later. So I'm giving you the takeaways first, and then we'll talk about the individual things. So what is this going to mean, right? Why does it matter to you what's going on in the litigation world? Either you're a young company or you don't have litigation, or you think you've put a fence around it. But I think things have changed enough that it's worth talking about. So what it might mean is that the FDA has less authority and will be less efficient. So if the FDA is being second guessed by litigants and courts around the country, instead of just relying on their general understanding of the statutes that come from Congress, instead the courts are going to interpret those statutes, they might be less willing to move faster because they're more likely to be wrong, right? In the face of some entity that's not involved in the process in the first place. Maybe it'll be better, right? Maybe if the FDA is not so emboldened, doesn't think its authority so great, it'll be less obtrusive. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that most minds think we have the gold standard for approval of our products in the United States. It's the best in the world. People buy our products around the world because of what we have to go through to get them approved. But we'll see what happens. And then what if the FDA says, well, Congress, that's a bad law. I don't understand it if I interpret it some way. So rewrite it. You know, that process isn't going to go fast. So it has a chance of hindering maybe not the most efficient system we have now, but at least a predictable system we have for getting products approved. Then there's a populist consumer protection movement afoot, where courts and litigants want to apply false advertising, Unfair Practices Act. All states have them, laws, and 2 medical device and drug companies that have cleared products, right? So you'd say that go through doctors first, right? Normally you'd say, well, why are those laws applied to us? Certainly we can't advertise falsely. We can't put out literature that misrepresents what we're saying. But generally, if we do things correctly, why are those laws applicable to us? So that's changing. And we got new plaintiffs, states, for example. They're not completely new. And the opioid case, and I was reminded of that today by Allie, whose dad's a plaintiff's lawyer in those cases, that's changed the model a little bit because states are involved in suing companies, right? Instead of an individual. So the state, since class actions and medical device and drug companies really don't work because the injuries are usually individual to a person, you don't have the same damage to all the people like they paid too much. And there's a premium you can calculate because of the representation you made about how the product works, so you do some calculation about that. But now we have OTC class actions, and we'll talk about that a little more. And so the landscape has changed in that regard. So that brings us to the Hawaii Supreme Court in Shikata versus Bristol Myers. And the questions I have for you: are we responsible for knowing the genetic profile of every one of our end users? That would be hard. Or should we be telling them before you take this product, or at least telling the doctors that before you prescribe this product, make sure a genetic test is taken to see what their profile is for purposes of this therapy? Seems to be yes in Hawaii, at least for Plavix. And do you warn consumers and doctors? So do we have, if there's a warning, which usually have no warnings, right? You have contraindications, right? You tell the professionals what the contraindications are, and they may be ignored by the doctor because doctors can do that. But that's sort of your responsibility, right? You tell people how the product should be used, what the intended use is, like Nate talked about. And you kind of, if you stay true to that, then what are we saying to consumers directly, right? We have doctors to talk to the consumers, and everybody used to think that that was much better than our industry talking directly to consumers, other than the limited TV advertising and other advertising we see, which is pretty well circumscribed. Anyway, the case in Hawaii was Plavix, which is usually prescribed with aspirin. It's an anticoagulant drug, or anti-clotting drug, excuse me. And so there was some facts that drive this case, and always bad facts make bad law. So this is a classic example of that. Bristol Myers had evidence back to the 1998 that there's a possibility that people with certain enzymes in their liver didn't process the medicine as well as others. So maybe not as protective against stroke and other things that clots cause. But it wasn't really finally determined, although it was becoming clearer as time goes on, but at least in the time frame when the lawsuit was brought, it wasn't that clear. In the FDA didn't require a change. They changed the black box label at some point, but there wasn't a, go get, find out what kind of genetic profile you have, right? And that's all changed, how you can do that now that we have full genetic sequencing. So it wasn't, and doctors didn't change. They were interviewed doctors for purposes of the trial, and they said, yeah, if we'd have known that, even the state health department of Hawaii, for purposes of reimbursement, said, yeah, that wouldn't have changed. If people prescribed this, we would have reimbursed it. So even if this information was known, or there was a different label based on the genetic profile, and race was another issue. That always helps, right? So Asians were, and that's a large percentage of the population of Hawaii, had a statistically less uptake of the medicine because of their genetic background than white people. And of course, unfortunately, most of the clinical studies was done on white people, or the 90% of it was. And so those facts were kind of out there, which didn't help, right? Then there was, of course, bad paper. People talk about science and money in the wrong way. It's one thing to have a budget item for clinical studies, right, in your accounting. It's another thing to say, we don't want to do this retrospective study because it might undercut the market. Don't say that, right? And there was paper that said that always leads to a bad result and makes it look like you're hiding things. Now, even if you state as a matter of fact that it might undercut the market, in other words, you're just doing pros and cons, right? And one of the cons would be that would happen, right? Or could happen. You got to be careful how you say that. And the paper was sort of unrelenting about being shy about new studies that would confirm the limitations of the medicine for people with certain genetic makeup. So that didn't help. So the allegation is the consumers were misled under Hawaii's consumer fraud statutes. And basically, they applied a reasonable consumer standard. That, which is odd to me, right? Because does a reasonable consumer even have a point of purchase? So I do food law class action cases too. Everything's focused on what happens at the point of purchase, right? What did that consumer have available to them when they were buying that juice? They had a label, they had a website. Well, that's probably it, right? And no doctor, nobody advising them, right? Whereas this medicine comes from the doctor, there is no point of purchase. So now suddenly we're applying state statutes with that, which is disconcerting to me. So the holding was, and the case isn't over because of a lot of mistakes that were made in the lower courts, but what was confirmed by the Supreme Court is that you can have an unfair practices claim that's good, that survives summary judgment. And the court decided that the failure to further research was against public policy and immoral, which is one of the prongs of consumer product laws in lots of states. And it should be unconstitutional because it seems helplessly vague. But anyway, that was the basis of the decision. And and under Hawaii law, you only have to have one of the prongs of the statute to make it a valid claim instead of 2 out of 3 or all 3. So the original damage award it was a bench trial to a judge, was $834 million. That was vacated because of a lot of other issues. But you can see the gymnastics that had to happen for the court to ignore. So FDA authority, right? Because FDA hadn't said you need a new label. They ignored the fact that, one other statement that they made, which is a cause for some concern, is that our consumer protection statutes are flexible laws to stop deceptive business practices for the protection of both consumers and honest business people. And it doesn't say what the elements of that are. So it's vague, and that's, every state has them. So this is not unique to Hawaii. It's just how it's applied here. Another thing, for purposes of preemption, of course, the Wyeth case comes into play, and that is, in order to take advantage of the label as it is, you have to have tried to change it if you thought it needed change. The logic of the Supreme Court of Hawaii was, and Bristol Myers never asked to have it changed, right? They never said, look at this data, hey, FDA, we got to change this and say something about this. They didn't say that. And the court said their obligation to say something the FDA was triggered when you can determine that they would have violated state law, the consumer fraud statute. Not FDA law, but the state law, which is now apparently the trigger for when you have to revisit a label in Hawaii, if this stands, which would make it harder, right? Because we're used to dealing with the FDA and their rules. All right, so that's that case. Then there's another set of cases. Sorry about the slides here. So another set of cases are over-the-counter drug cases. And here the plaintiffs are taking a page out of the food class action cases. They're finding some defect, and I'm using that in a completely non-legal sense, in products. They have an ingredient that's a carcinogen. They don't have, another ones they don't have evidence for, like for decongestants, that the efficacy is as high as it is. So they're using consumer fraud statutes now to attack efficacy and what you have to disclose is in the product. Because you could have, and this is not just a state of California, California Proposition 65 issue. This is a broader attack where there's some element in the product, could be in the casing of a pill, it could be in the packaging or something else that has been shown to be carcinogenous. You're not telling consumers about it explicitly, so it's fraud. And so another thing that they're using, that they use in food cases, they have independent labs. Those labs do an analysis of the products to see what's in it and what the percentage are and things like that. And now that's being applied to over-the-counter medicines. And you have litigation funding now as an increasing part of the litigation against med tech, and that's just money from wherever. It's securitization of litigation, which is not new, but seems to be continuing to grow. So what are the advantages? Why do plaintiffs do this? Attack over-the-counter medicines and less now, maybe, we'll see. Prescription medicines, well, you don't have to prove use or product ID like you have to do with medicine and medical devices. I mean, you have to actually know the person got this device or this prescription, took it then, and it doesn't have to be exact. There's no doctor to worry about, although you can get prescriptions, obviously, for Advil and things from your doctor, but generally not part. It's easier to attack marketing activity and dispensing, and you can bypass the manufacturers and sue retailers. So I don't know if any of you are involved in that area, but again, it's a world that's growing in the OTC medicines world. And so if you're developing new ones that are based on CBD or any of those types of products, you're going to have to be concerned with this and with your claims. Obviously, you have claims issues from a regulatory perspective, but you should also think about that even though it passes regulatory muster, it might not be safe from state's attorney general or the plaintiff's bar otherwise. So that's that. Then the last case I want to talk about is the phishing cases related to the Chevron deference doctrine. And this does impact your work, or will possibly. Chevron's the case from 40 years ago that said federal judges must defer to agencies' reasonable interpretation of ambiguous laws in litigation. And there's a two-part test. Is the law ambiguous? Is the agency's interpretation reasonable? And this was just argued before the Supreme Court. There are two phishing cases. The facts are that the phishing captains or businesses were complaining that they had to pay for the regulators to be on the boat with them to make sure they were following the rules regarding their harvest and what their practice is fishing. And I won't go into the details of the what was ambiguous about the statute. Be that as it may, there are at least 3 justices on the Supreme Court that think that Chevron's a bad idea. 19,000 cases have discussed or relied on Chevron. So even if you think it's a bad idea, it's a predictable idea that if you say you followed the FDA's interpretation and we're going to defer to them because Congress told them to figure it out. So when you think about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it's a constitution. It's not a set of specific statutes, right? So they have to figure lots of things out. They can't just ask Congress to, they could never do it, right? So the very nature of what EPA, FDA, and other agencies do is to take a broad charge from Congress and implement it. And there's a constitutional issue, of course, about delegation of authority from the executive, from the legislative to the executive branch, and if that's done properly. And so that's what drives it. And Justice Gorsuch, this is his thing. And so it was bound to come up, and it has. So, well, why do we care? Well, we care about predictability in business a little bit, right? So right now we may have an FDA that we don't particularly like. I don't know if you do or not. Maybe you get along great with them and you know what they expect, and then you do your job and get your products cleared or whatever. But their authority is being challenged by this. And so we have to determine what might replace what we're doing now. And we'll talk about that for a minute. Right now, the court has used one thing to limit Chevron, and that is the major questions doctrine. This is a little inside baseball, but if you remember the Clean Water Act, and the government made an interpretation of it to apply to certain streams and not other, whatever. And the court said, nah, that's too big an issue for you to decide. So any major political or economic significance can't be left to agencies. They have to be decided by Congress. So that has been used in some instances to limit regulators' authority. So the concern is, right, what's going to take its place? Is FDA going to how are they going to operate in a little more uncertain world about their interpretations of what they're supposed to do? And first, we'll talk about what the courts might do as a resolution, and then we'll talk about what are the possibilities, because this could impact your business. So you can instruct justices not to too quickly determine that laws are ambiguous, right? Figure out a way to read the law by the plain language, use the normal legal, statutory, interpretive dictates that we learn in law school, and just say, this is what the law means, right? It's not ambiguous, although there's always 2 sides telling you that it is ambiguous in litigation. Better define reasonableness. Well, good luck with that, right? That's a pretty subjective. But you could put some boundaries around that. Make sure the agency is acting with the force of law. That is, it is a rule. Is it a statute or a rule, or is it just guidance? And this also impacts preemption, but right, if it's just guidance and the FDA is enforcing something against your client based on guidance, then they lose, I think is what the court could say. It's because that's not law. Right? We all take it as that because we want to get along with FDA, and from a business perspective, if we do what they want us to do, then we'll get through faster. And we usually want guidance, right? Because it helps us understand what a rule might actually mean once it's finished. Look for statutory indications that Chevron may not apply at all. So read the statute more clearly to determine that Congress meant this. FDA, you don't get to change that. Even if you think Congress couldn't have meant that, That's what it means. And so I think that's what that option is. Instruct the courts on how to deal with silence, and that is, what if nobody says, what if it's just not addressed, right? Either in statutes or interpretive rules. So you could send it back to the FDA's, like the word natural. There's all sorts of litigation around having natural on your labels and food. Well, court said, well, there is no definition of natural. So until FDA defines what natural means, you're out of luck. So that would be one way to deal with it. So some of the concerns with Chevron being completely jettisoned is it going to be retroactive or not? And, oh, I'm late. So that's a concern because there's thousands of cases that might get relitigated. I doubt that would happen. That makes no sense, right? People have done things based on what was said. The other is that, do you be careful what you wish for? So the populist theory on this is that big guys make the regulations, big companies, little guys do follow the regulations and get squashed by them. That's the theory behind. It was actually said in the argument, not quite like that, but that was it. So do you want the district court judge in such and such deciding your regulatory fate because they disagree with the FDA? I mean, which happens some anyway, but more often, and then you'd have 10 different interpretations of a rule, right, instead of one. And is that a better working environment or not, even though you don't sort of like the behemoth and authority of FDA? So that's what I have, and I think we need to get on. Do you have questions?
I'll ask one. Do you want to make a prediction on Chevron?
Yeah, I think they'll set up barriers. They'll try to restrict how it can be used. And they're super smart people, and I think they'll do that and try to give courts more guidance on how to rely on it less. I don't know if you tell your students, we teach this stuff, and I tell them if Chevron's in there, the agency wins. You don't have to read the case anymore. Right? So probably trying to limit that sort of effect of it, right? So, yeah. All right, thanks.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, well, let's keep the fun rolling here. It's our last session. Just want to say thanks to the Capital Factory and the team here for making today happen. It's been fantastic. Yeah, I want to introduce the panel. Maybe I'll allow you guys to do that. We have Albert Lee, Steve Tameo, and Scott Way. So maybe we'll start with you, Al, if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Al Lee. I'm the Chief Legal Officer and Secretary for Owlet. We are a NYSE microcap traded company that makes smart baby monitoring products for pediatrics. So we have a product that was recently cleared by the FDA called the Dream Sock that fits over a baby's foot provides real-time live health data, as well as notifications around pulse rate, oxygen saturation, and movement. Prior to Owlet, I've had the fortune of working at a number of med device companies, selling everything from total joint to implants to biologics. So I appreciate Gardner inviting me to speak.
Thanks for being here. Steve?
Yep. Steve Tamayo. I work for Sight Sciences. I'm the VP/Chief Compliance Officer for the company. We're a small, basically startup. Well, not startup anymore, but I've been there since 2020. I've been in the medical device or pharmaceutical realm for, geez, a long time. So currently our products, we have 3 products on the market, 2 basically related to glaucoma and 1 for dry eye. So it's been a great adventure there. A lot of good stuff going on. So
Thank you. Scott?
Sure, Scott Way. I'm General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer for Impulse Dynamics. I've been in med device for, I don't know, 25 odd years with some of the folks who are in the room, former colleagues. And I've been in orthopedics as well as spine and diagnostics. Impulse Dynamics has a implantable device similar to a pacemaker that helps patients who are suffering from heart failure. Been a fun ride so far, and we're hoping we have 1 product on the market and hoping in the next couple of years to have another product approved.
Great, thank you. Well, again, thanks for being here, guys. I'll just kind of run through some questions. I know you saw all of these before. We have a lot of questions, and we will not be able to get through all of them. I'm hoping we can get through 1 regulatory, 1 compliance, 1 privacy, and 1 litigation related question. That's my goal. Also, just thanks for everyone attending here, and just to give kudos to Austin. There's so much exciting stuff going on here, not just great music and food, but the med tech industry seems to be exploding. So it's fun to be guests in this great city. Just kind of kicking off with regulatory, you know, I'm curious how much you all get involved in some of these regulatory decisions. Talk about, like, you know, classification of a medical device. Nate got into that a bit. And I know I've been a part of some situations where we thought, I was actually an investor in one situation, everyone agreed this product was a device, and then something changed with the law, and voila, it's a drug, which, you know, really impacts the entire, you know, thesis and strategy for an organization. I'm just kind of curious if you all would like to comment on how you get involved, if at all, because I've seen it in different companies where legal compliance are completely siloed from regulatory, and regulatory is running the show. And hearing from Amanda about the case where the guy is just like making up clearances, that is absolutely wild. You know, how, I'm just kind of thinking, I'm wondering if there were attorneys involved in that corporation, and if they even ever would think to pressure test any of what's happening in regulatory. So if you wouldn't mind commenting on that.
Yeah, maybe I can start off because it hits home. First off, I guess I would answer the question by saying that sometimes regulatory, and particularly approvals or clearances, is years in the making, right? So it's not an overnight kind of decision. So depending on when you come into the company, it's really important. Are you pre-authorization or post? That's the first thing to think about. But just sort of my war story here, and probably it's an appropriate setting, is Owlet, as a digital health company, was operating as a consumer tech company. Really up into, it had started in 2014. We were selling products by 2016. FDA hadn't come out with digital health guidance yet. So the company was operating as a consumer tech company and doing what they felt like everyone else was doing in the market. Let's monitor health, let's monitor heart rate, let's monitor oxygen. In 2021, they got an FDA warning letter because they were told basically by the FDA after multiple discussions, no, you're a medical device. You have to register. So the classification hits people by surprise. And I think if you are in an industry where it's very understood, that's one thing. But if you're in novel technologies, it's a completely different thing. So the landscape of your industry and technology is important. I've had the fortune to manage quality and regulatory in 2 of my companies. So having it roll up into legal can, have its advantages. But we know that in med tech, it's very cross-functional. What a lawyer looks at might be different than what a regulatory expert looks at, even though they're both interpreting the law. So, in terms of classification, I would say, your general question of how do you see it working? Every company is a little different based on the size and your resources. A startup, it may be one person that has to have the wherewithal to say, wait a minute, did someone even look at this marketing material before it went out? Let's go call Mark, right? In other groups where it's like at Abbott, there are tons of resources, but every group is siloed. So you're trying to figure out, how do I get a cross-functional look at a regulatory issue? But I know that's a long way of saying it's complicated depending on what the technology is, where you're at, what your teams look like.
Yeah, for me, my answer is pretty easy. I haven't been involved because most of the products, for the most part, were already approved prior to me joining. But I do know our regulatory group worked pretty closely with an outside firm, because at that time, I don't even think my boss was there. It was such a small startup. So they were working with a pretty big firm on getting that done. So now I address the issues after the fact, all the fun stuff, but prior to that, yeah.
Yeah, so for me, I usually am brought into company after commercialization, so certainly after those decisions are made. But I really liked the talk this morning because it was very forward thinking, and that's what you have to be as a startup when you're making these decisions. You have to think forward, well, how is this product going to be marketed? I'd say also not just how is it going to be marketed, but how's it going to be paid for? That's one of the biggest things that impacts not just classification, but your marketing and everything that you do as a company. And if you're not understanding how it's going to be paid for in the future, you're going to get down the road and you're going to learn, well, I can't get paid for this great device that I've created and put out there on the market, and I may need to change the classification at that point in time. Well, then you have to go through that entire process to do that in order to fit into a category of payment. So there's so many things to think about at the early stage of just product development. Is not just it. Just because this product is helping people, the regulatory environment will cause you to make different decisions. And it's good to get folks like Gardner involved early who can help you think forward and not just about the specific issue that you're dealing with today, because all of these things will have major implications to your company down the road when you get to actual commercialization.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for that plug. I will take care of you after the program here. No, in all seriousness, though, that's a great point you raised, because I have seen that where one word changed, or a few words in the indication, can take you from a place of almost no reimbursement to significant reimbursement. And I suppose as lawyers for the company too, you don't want to have your client get in that situation, because if there's pressure on them and the coding's wrong, maybe they'll use different code, which does get paid, right? I'm just curious, and and I'll move on to a reg question here next. But, or excuse me, we're talking about reg now, getting into compliance a little bit. But any advice to, we've got a lot of GCs, I know several here today, and then also remote. Advice for them, I think some of it maybe is culturally. If you're coming into a company, how does legal kind of get in there and start to pressure test some of these things? I think as lawyers, most lawyers are generally not as shy people, so they probably wouldn't have a problem horning in on that sort of situation. But I was kind of curious if you have any advice for folks in the audience on that. So the question is, if you're a GC, how do you even broach that subject to start to get engaged to pressure test some of what's going on in regs? So you could, and I know it's kind of a funny joke, Probably not funny for the guy. Is he in jail right now, Amanda? He's in prison. Not funny for him, but he kind of made some mistakes there. But you know, ultimately, just thinking you want to avoid those issues for your clients, and it can be very significant if we're seeing labeling issues and manufacturing issues turning into DOJ, OIG settlements. You want to avoid that risk for your client. So, yeah, if you could comment on that.
Well, I think the best advice really for the GC is be inquisitive while making friends, right? I think, you know, the classic wisdom is your role as a GC is to know your business. So by being inquisitive and getting to know your business, you're quickly assessing, do I have the internal expertise to manage this risk? What is the experience of my regulatory team? What's the experience of my legal team? What's the experience of my marketing team? Because you may have a marketing team that doesn't even understand what off-label promotion is. You may have a regulatory team that's being too stringent because they're not understanding the technology slightly different than the stent that they worked on at the last company. So the more inquisitive you are to understand what am I playing with without ruffling feathers and without being threatening, and while you're making friends, you very quickly get a sense of, well, what is the risk level that I should be expending on this? Because, you know, obviously as in-house, you're just as concerned about them selling product, and you're going to be constantly pressured to do that. But you know that a few words can make a difference. So I would say that. I mean, I think, again, to the point that you may be in a startup and you may be dealing with a very innovative co-founder, your job is really educating them, right, on the risk and why is it important and how does it tie to reimbursement and marketing, and you're ultimately not in jail. But it may be very different if you've got to change minds because the regulatory lead is already kind of set in their ways. So, you know, it's an interesting dynamic, but you really want to be able to navigate to get to the right result for your company.
Thanks. Yeah, Steve, kind of same question.
Yeah.
I think it's, you know, and by the way, one thing I love about this panel, we got GC, how many are all, I know Steve, you're a compliance officer, GCL and Scott, but you're also playing compliance officer, right? So you've got both hats. Al, do you just wear one?
I've been compliance officer before, but not currently at this company.
Yeah, so I feel like the roles are so similar and that's the issues we're discussing. So please, Steve.
I think it also depends on the type of company you have, your structure, right? Because prior to me being at Sight Sciences, I was with a company called Alcon, really big company, right? So for the GC that sits there, he's far and removed in some sense, right? So he really has to depend on his team and the embeddedness within the business. And that was the one thing when I was at Alcon, they really stress is you're the business partner, you're there, whether you're legal, compliance, regulatory, we're there to support the business. It's a little, in some sense, easier at Sight Sciences because we're so small. It's quite easy, but to Al's point, there's a lot of education. There's a lot of people there that just need to be educated of what off-label is, for example. Sometimes it's a little more on the marketing side, but I would say it's a continuous of embeddedness, education, and partnership, because they also have to trust you, right? So that they come to you. But I think for me, that's the thing I would make sure and stress is you need at least those three things.
Anything to add, Scott?
Well, I guess one thing that Al said that it's kind of my answer to everything is make friends. Make friends within the organization. You need to have people to be able to come to you and be able to talk with you. And then with respect to the regulatory matters and the inquisitiveness, don't be afraid to not be the smartest person in the room. You know, you're going to be talking with experts who know the regulations. Let them teach you. You're there to issue spot. And I think that's one of the best things that we can bring to the table is think about what are the problems that can occur listen to these folks, learn from them, learn about your company and your device, try to educate yourself, and then try to issue spot and help them think through where the problems can be and how to solve those problems together. But make friends, first and foremost.
Friends is good. You don't want to be on an island. So just kind of moving to the compliance subject, and I think it's sort of from my perspective, when I read that headline, like we all did a month or so ago, about the record number of OIG whistleblower cases initiated, I was kind of just shocked by that. I guess maybe not shocked. I was like, wow, it's really happening. I think that the money signs are, the dollar signs are, in the eyes of, or in the minds of a lot of employees that work in companies. If they're not happy and maybe they brought some things up, things don't change, they're like, wow, payday, right? Salespeople generally like money. I think that's common. So if they're looking at, wow, I could really multiply my effect here by being a whistleblower, that's concerning for our industry. It's not going away. I'm just wondering if this is on, and you all work at perfect companies where everything's perfect and there's no whistleblowers, I'm sure. But even if that's true, you could still have someone make up a case or misinterpret facts, right? There's, I'm sure, some eloquent quotes around. There's some science around this where juries, you'll have two jurists and they'll interpret things differently, even though they're looking at the same picture. They derive different conclusions. So even if everything's perfect at a company, there's still the potential for this whistleblower threat. I'm just curious if this is on your radar, or it's just kind of like, yeah, it's been going on since the 90s and it's always going to be there. Curious and ultimately, if it's on your radar, if there's things that you would recommend to mitigate any of this risk. I know Amanda went through some great suggestions there. Maybe again, we'll just keep going, starting with you, Al, and then work down.
Well, it's interesting because I think I can't remember. I remember rereading this stat a while ago when when compliance was more my topic. But it's not only the number of whistleblowers, but it's many of these whistleblowers have actually brought the cases up before. So they actually oftentimes feel not heard. You gave the example of the disgruntled salesperson who was laid off, but more times than not, it's somebody who sees something, brings it up, but doesn't feel heard. It's certainly an issue. It's certainly the case that the government is well incentivized to investigate and prosecute these. So it's a way of life for any med tech healthcare company. I think it is something we think about, but the way I think about it more holistically is you're trying to improve the compliance of the company as a whole. You're not agonizing over this person or that person per se, but you're sort of saying, look, what is my culture of compliance? What's the tone from the top? How are people feeling heard? Do they have an outlet? So you definitely want to make sure that your reporting lines of communication are open and robust, and people interpret those as being there, and they won't have retaliation if they report something. So as the GC or the compliance officer, you're really thinking about what is that culture of compliance look like? Because more times than not, if they feel heard and they get their question addressed, they're not going to be the one complaining. And that's what I think most companies fail. Now, if the tone isn't good and you have a systemic, well, this is just okay, we're going to keep doing this, then that's usually when, these things happen. So you're thinking about it holistically and making sure is the design of the compliance program going to catch these things and bring them up?
And yeah, so really having the channels of communication up is key. And then culturally, I know exactly what you mean. Sometimes we've all worked at different companies. I'm sure there's different risk profiles at different companies as well. But I like what you said about the methods of communication. I know I've worked with, I think I keep track, it's something like 700 different companies in the past 25 years, because I was in the industry for the first 10. But you know, one particular client, I remember one day I was doing an under secondment, and they put out like little table tents, and they had banners for compliance, and it really did convey the message, like, we are taking this seriously. We want to hear about your concerns. Steve, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, most companies have the hotline, right? So you have the hotline, the basic standard. For me, what I think is important is to make sure management, whether it's senior management, the C-suite, or your middle management, I think it's important for them to be also trained and understand what retaliation is, for example, right? Because I think, to what everybody's saying here, employees want to feel heard. Sometimes employees do tell their managers, sometimes that doesn't trickle up to where it needs to go, whether it's legal compliance or whomever. I have seen situations where employees have complained to their manager. The managers think that they're addressing it, but not understanding maybe there's other things going on. And then the next thing you know is you have a case where employees filed some kind of claim or something like that. So for me, I think it's making sure your management understands what a whistleblower is, or who they could be, how to take their complaints or allegations seriously, and you know, what to do with those when you do receive an allegation or a complaint. So it's also training, and we do annual training on our hotline on what's retaliation, our non-retaliation policy. So we do annual training on that. I'm going to design some training specifically for managers to understand what retaliation is. But for most of the investigations I've done, whether at Site Sciences or prior, employees just want to be heard and understand that, you know, their complaints are being taken seriously. I think for the most part, as long as you're showing, you can't always appease every employee, but as long as you document that you addressed it, I think for the most part, you should address the issue.
Scott, thoughts?
Going back to making friends. That means, you know, across the board, having an open door policy, both for yourself as well as the rest of the compliance team. Make sure that they are also, you know, out there making friends, and having the ability for folks to come and talk to them when needed, and that they're being heard, and they bring that up to you, and you have to take action, right? And you have to document it. And that's the piece that what we do best, hopefully. You document all of that and the action that you took, but then go talk to that employee after the fact. We heard you, we did this investigation, this is the action that we took. And that's the real being heard, right? Or we disagreed with you and these are the reasons why, but we understand and we appreciate you coming to us. Please come again. You know, if you see something, we always want it. Let's be risk averse in these areas. So feel free to come and talk anytime, and just being open to that rather than shutting folks down, and making sure even when they come to you, when it's not an actionable item, that you show appreciation for them coming forward.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yes, please.
Yeah, Scott's, I mean, he keeps saying make friends, but I think in this situation, that's really vital. I had a case just not recently where an employee came to me and said, you know, hey, Steve, you know, my manager said you're a good person that I can trust, and I wanted to ask you about X, Y, and Z. I think trust really is important. So I really re-emphasize what he's saying about building that trust and friendship.
Yeah, but that's very important what you say about the trust, and that's something also you have to inculcate into managers, but also your compliance team and HR, so
Right.
that employees know when they come to you, if it's in confidence, that that's not going to have any implications for them.
Correct.
And that trust thing is very important, and ensuring your integrity. Sometimes the making friends bleeds into, oh, well, then I have to be a popular person and I have to act in a certain way. Well, you don't have to. You still have to act with integrity, and you have to show that to all of the employees, that they feel that they can come and trust in your confidence.
That's great. Thank you. Great comments. Yeah, I'll just make one quick one, just kind of picking up again on Mana's presentation with the not being viewed as the sales prevention team. It's like you're there to hear when maybe they think that the company's crossing the line, you address those concerns, but also then they see you as somebody they can trust to come with a program if it's new, because maybe they think it's okay, but there's actually risk, or maybe there's not, and it's fine. I think that from my perspective, the compliance profession, if you will, or that part of the law, healthcare compliance, has really evolved from one of kind of police officer to trusted confidant. You know, somebody that you want to talk to before you spend $500,000 on your next DTCA campaign, or whatever it may be. Great. So moving to privacy, quick question: do we need 18 state privacy laws, or should we get one federal law that takes care of all of these? I don't know if, again, if this is on the radar of, you know, your corporations or your peers, but yeah, I'll park the question right there and let you riff on that.
Well, I think for folks that hadn't heard, there is this undercurrent of a federal law making its way through Congress in some sense. And it's a great question, because as a practical matter, if you're a GC thinking about how do I keep up with all this stuff, I can barely get to what I'm being asked to do. I think when I thought about this question, obviously the first thing is, you know, it is nice to have an expert. So whether it's Paul, whether it's someone else, I think that that's when you go to an outside counsel who, first of all, has a federal approach, meaning they may be based in Minnesota or they may be based in California, but they're attuned to everything. Not so much to get the law, because I think you can get the state surveys of what the laws say, but it's really just to kind of bounce off scenarios. I think the other thing as a cheat code, if you're a small company, is just be aware of what the kind of higher standard is, like whether you're meeting a GDPR or CPRA standard. You can sort of cut through a lot of the other stuff, because there are nuances, but you want to sort of say, hey, can I meet a high bar? I think if you look at that as a framework, then you're also sort of saying, what are the real risks for me? Because I think a lot of lawyers get caught up in, well, this is personal data, you have to do X, Y, Z with. But if your business doesn't use that data, then it's not a risk, right? So how you manage the data in your company for your business model will also have to sort of be juxtaposed against that conversation with your privacy lawyer. So it definitely is an effort, but if you haven't really thought through the business model scenarios, that's probably the most useful thing you can do.
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer is, yeah, I would love federal, right? So you don't have to deal with all the different states, but especially as a small company. But for current situation, I just call Paul. Paul helps me quite a lot. But as we progress with different programs, having to deal with the different states, to Al's point, sometimes we just use a baseline and then go based on the facts, depending on, okay, do we have to change certain things? But for the most part, we use a baseline. But as like I said, as we have new programs coming in, it's getting a little more complex.
Yeah, I'll add too, because I forgot to bring up, I mean, getting to know your business is so key in terms of like what it does, right? So if you're advising a healthcare business and you're only based in Texas, it's different than sort of a digital health company that's going to get data from every 50 states, right? Or internationally.
Right.
So if you think about your data, have you done your assessment of the data flow? Also think about your intended population, and have you really looked at that? I mean, at the end of the day, the risk-based approach is driven by the facts and circumstances of your business. So you may not need to know the Washington law, but certainly you'll need to know California or something like that. So think about who your customer is and who you're touching.
I'd say these laws scare the heck out of me because of the fines that are involved. You know, one data breach, so one misplaced laptop, and suddenly you have 10,000 pieces of individual information out there, and each one can be, I don't know, $1,000 fine. I mean, it can rack up, and I think that the state's attorneys general are seeing this as potential cash flow future opportunities for them. I doubt that we're going to see a federal preemptive statute that will prevent the states from having their own. I'd love it, although I guess it depends on what we get, right? Depends on what it is. For me, on privacy, I think first and foremost, know your IT team, talk to them about what's happening with all of the different ways in which you're receiving information and where is it stored. And there are great tools these days to ensure protection of that. It used to be a laptop was misplaced and suddenly there's a breach and you've got to make a notification. Well, nowadays you can brick a laptop if you put in the right tools. Look at, it's not just your laptops, but it's, what are on the phones that your sales folks use? Are they using text-based messaging, or do you have an internal messaging solution provided by a provider like Microsoft that you can brick that as well, so that you can remove all information if there is something misplaced, and then you ensure that there's not that potential breach that causes all of the fines. So, I mean, get with IT, know that first and foremost, and then fix your website. Does your website collecting the wrong information, and do you have the right notices that you have to have on the website? Those are all easy ways in which to ensure that you've got a program that at least is protecting your company enough. And then you dive into all of these statutes and figure out how you better comply with them on an individual statute by statute basis.
Thank you. Well, I know we're at time, so we won't get into, I won't ask anyone to dig into the Hawaiian Supreme Court case or Chevron for that matter, but we will be watching Chevron because that does impact this industry. 19,000 cases citing Chevron. Wow. That sounds like a lot of work potentially if that's majorly changed. So great. Well, thank you very much for joining us at this panel. Thanks everybody for attending the program today. Bye-bye.